The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Thank you for the question, and it gives an opportunity to talk about the incredible sacrifice of so many people. I think of all the frontline workers, all those frontline workers that kept us going in the most difficult parts of this pandemic. The retail workers, the logistic workers, the truck drivers, the frontline healthcare workers, and how it's been so difficult for these frontline workers. And in a lot of ways, these frontline healthcare workers and frontline workers were abandoned as well. They were the most important workers in some cases that were paid the least. And so we fought to make sure that they were recognized, not just with their hard work and sacrifice, but with fair compensation. And that has to continue. The healthcare workers right now are struggling. They are at their brink. Nurses have told us about the crisis in healthcare. So we have to make sure we're supporting them with real investments. And we are in a real crisis. The fact that one of the busiest borders in North America could be shut down, causing thousands and thousands of workers to lose their wages, is unacceptable. It is wrong. We need to make sure workers are protected, and that's why we reluctantly support this measure, to make sure this convoy is ended and that workers are protected, that people are protected, the residents of Ottawa are supported. We're standing with them.
For a quick short one, the honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Always a pleasure to rise on behalf of the people of Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou. It's interesting that the honourable leader of the NDP has spoken about the division of the government, and yet he has consistently propped up this government that has chosen to divide. Now, in his speech, he spoke about the fact that the Emergencies Act should not touch on Quebec, and yet he is supporting legislation which, theoretically, could freeze bank accounts in Quebec. So, will he support that aspect of the Act because it cannot be separated from the remainder? Yes or no?
The honourable member for Burnaby South in 30 seconds.
We want to make sure that this Act is used in a way that stops a convoy, and it's not used where it's not necessary. But I want to be very clear about division. I certainly have said that in this House, divisions have been flamed, and that the story of this pandemic is one of solidarity. But I want to be clear. Conservatives have purposely tried to use this convoy as an opportunity to score points and cause problems for the Liberals. The Liberals have also looked at this as an opportunity to divide and wedge. And I'm saying that it is wrong to do that. We cannot be wedging people on a thing that is not partisan. This is a crisis that we have to come together on. The pandemic is one where we all have to tackle together, and it should not be something to score points on.
Brings to debate, continuing debate, the Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will be splitting my time with the President of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada and the Minister of Emergency Preparedness. And I see that it's now Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm pleased and honoured, but also do this with a deep sense of obligation to rise today to speak to the invocation of the Emergencies Act by our government and to the motion in this House to affirm the government's decision. Canada is a rule of law country. By declaring a public order emergency under the Emergencies Act, we followed the law and we are acting within it. There are clear conditions set out in the Emergencies Act in order for a public order emergency to be declared. Our government believes those conditions have been met and that those same conditions required the Government of Canada to act. La loi sur les mesures d'urgence existe depuis 1988 et a remplacé la loi sur les mesures de guerre. Elle est différente de cette dernière de deux façons très importantes. Premièrement, la loi sur les mesures d'urgence contient plusieurs balises et sauvegardes, dont un examen parlementaire. Deuxièmement, les mesures prises en vertu de la loi doivent respecter la Charte canadienne des droits et libertés. I want to reiterate this point. The preamble to the Emergencies Act states, and whereas the Governor and Council, in taking such special temporary measures, would be subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights, and must have regard to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, particularly with respect to those fundamental rights that are not to be limited or abridged even in a national emergency. Madam Speaker, any and all of our government action will be subject to the Charter and it is my job as Attorney General to ensure this. I take that responsibility incredibly seriously. There is therefore a further check in the parliamentary oversight process as well. The Emergencies Act can only be invoked in specific, serious circumstances that amount to a national emergency. In order to meet the threshold for a national emergency, 3 conditions must be met. First, we must be in a situation that either seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and exceeds the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it, or seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada. Second, the provinces and territories' capacity to handle the situation must be considered insufficient or show gaps. And third, we must conclude that the situation cannot be handled adequately under any other Canadian law, including provincial or territorial laws. Our government believes these conditions were met, and yesterday we tabled an explanation of the reasons for issuing the declaration as required by the Act. We also tabled yesterday, as required, a report on any consultation with the provinces with respect to the declaration. I would especially like to highlight the support of British Columbia, Ontario, and Newfoundland and Labrador, as noted in the document of invoking the Act to respond to this national emergency. Une fois l'urgence déclarée, la loi sur les mesures d'urgence permet au gouvernement fédéral d'adopter les décrets et les règlements nécessaires pour intervenir. Notre gouvernement respecte les droits et libertés des Canadiens tels que protégés par la Charte. C'est notre intention d'utiliser uniquement les pouvoirs nécessaires, raisonnables et mesurés pour résoudre la crise de façon rapide et sécuritaire, consistant avec la section 1 de la Charte. As you have seen, our government has introduced targeted orders under the Act. While the Act technically applies to all of Canada, we have been very careful to tailor orders to be as focused as possible, and only in those places affected by blockades and illegal occupations will we see any change at all. We have introduced the following measures to bring the situation under control. Temporary regulation and prohibition of public assemblies that lead to a breach of the peace and go beyond lawful protest. The situation in Ottawa and blockades at certain border crossings have gone far beyond lawful protest. Temporarily designating and securing places where blockades are to be prohibited. This could include borders, approaches to borders, critical infrastructure, hospitals, and democratic institutions. Temporarily directing persons to render essential services to relieve impacts of blockades on Canada's economy. This could include tow trucks and their drivers, for compensation, of course. Temporarily authorizing or directing financial institutions to render essential services to relieve the impact of blockades, including regulating and prohibiting the use of property to fund or support the blockades. Temporarily enabling the RCMP to enforce municipal bylaws and provincial offences where required. And finally, temporary imposition of fines or imprisonment for contravention of any order or regulation made under Section 19 of the Emergencies Act. Madame la Présidente, nous traversons une période extraordinaire. Et le gouvernement du Canada s'est engagé à respecter et à protéger les droits individuels tout en préservant l'ordre public. Cela comprend toutes les mesures prises par le gouvernement du Canada en vertu de la loi sur les mesures d'urgence, y compris les ordres ou les décrets ou les actions des représentants du gouvernement. I want to repeat what I previously stated. It is my responsibility and commitment as Attorney General of Canada to ensure that all steps taken by our government are consistent with the Charter as required by the Act. The Emergencies Act, Madam Speaker, also contains a number of significant limits, checks, and safeguards. As required by the Act, on several occasions over the past week, the Prime Minister and members of Cabinet consulted with the Premiers and members of their respective governments. Having now declared a public order emergency, we tabled the declaration in Parliament, as required, within 7 days. And in fact, we did so as quickly as possible, well before the 7 days, tabling yesterday for discussion today so that Parliament could perform its important oversight role. In the coming days, a parliamentary committee will be struck to provide oversight while the emergency is in effect. This declaration only lasts for 30 days, unless renewed. However, we can, and we sincerely hope to, revoke the emergency much sooner. Le Parlement a le pouvoir de revoquer un décret,
Parliament has the power
ce qui assure
to
que toutes
repeal
les
a
mesures
decree which
prises le
ensures that
seront
all
de
measures
manière
taken will be
responsable,
done so
mesurée
responsibly,
et dans le respect des
moderately,
balises
and
établies.
while respecting the
Orders must be
criteria
tabled in Parliament
established.
within 2 days for review of parliamentarians, as was done yesterday. Parliament has the power to amend or revoke any order made under the Act. In closing, I want to address 2 critiques of the official opposition. They say this declaration is unnecessary. The illegal blockades and occupations are ending. I say, look outside. They are not. I say, look at the streets of Winnipeg. The ones that have ended did so after the Prime Minister announced we were moving to declare a public order emergency. We are achieving what we intended to achieve with these measures, and we're doing it in a most measured and responsible way. We have seen further how fluid the situation is. Since we declared this emergency, we have seen other potential blockades stopped. We want law enforcement to have the necessary tools for a limited time to ensure we do not have a repeat of any of the blockades. The official opposition is talking about rights. On this side of the House, we take rights seriously. So did the Progressive Conservative government that introduced the Emergencies Act and ensured it was charter compliant. That was the right thing to do. We are invoking this act to end illegal blockades and occupations. We are invoking it to restore the rights of those who cannot walk safely on the streets of downtown Ottawa. We are invoking it to protect the rights of workers to earn a living, of businesses to serve the public, for people to move freely across international borders. Let's not confuse illegal blockades and occupations with lawful protest. We know what a lawful protest looks like. It does not look like what is happening on Wellington Street or what transpired in Coutts or in Emerson. So we have declared a public order emergency to help law enforcement deal with these issues quickly and to protect us from them happening again. Our goal, Madam Speaker, is to see order restored and for this emergency declaration to be lifted as soon as possible. Thank you. Merci.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Act expressly prohibits violation of charter rights. The declaration put forward by the government assumes power to regulate or prohibit private transfers of funds to protesters, including the ability to mandate the reporting of such transfers and freezing of accounts without judicial oversight. How is this measure compliant with Section 8 charter rights to be free from unreasonable search and seizure?
Well, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada.
I thank the honourable member for the question, Madam Speaker. Indeed, this Act is compliant with Section 8 of the Charter against unreasonable search and seizure. It is an extension of procedures and practices that already exist with respect to anti-terrorism financing and money laundering, Madam Speaker. So we are extending these practices and procedures that already exist, that are already Charter compliant, and to this other situation, i.e. funding illegal blockades and protests, and we are going to do it in a reasonable manner. It will be Charter compliant, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député d'Avignon-la-Métis, Matane Matapédia.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie le ministre pour son discours. Je pense qu'on s'entend tous de ce côté-ci de la Chambre pour dire que c'est une mesure de dernier recours et j'ai l'impression que la situation actuelle dicte qu'on n'en est pas là. Et il y a plusieurs autres outils qui auraient pu être utilisés avant. Et j'ai l'impression que ça fait en sorte qu'on vient de banaliser un petit peu la loi sur les mesures d'urgence. Et je ne suis pas juriste, mais pas besoin de faire une recherche très exhaustive pour se rendre compte qu'il y avait des outils dans le Code criminel canadien qu'on aurait très bien pu utiliser avant d'en arriver à la loi sur les mesures d'urgence. Pourquoi pas porter des accusations criminelles contre les gens qui bloquaient des ponts, contre les gens qui c'est plus une manifestation légale ici, qui font vraiment un siège à Ottawa. Pourquoi ne pas avoir fait ça? Alors j'aimerais qu'il m'explique pourquoi il n'a pas utilisé les autres outils que le Code criminel lui donnait avant d'en arriver à la loi sur les mesures d'urgence.
Le ministre de la Justice.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie l'honorable collègue pour sa question. Ce qu'on a trouvé dès le début de la crise, et on a travaillé avec, évidemment, les autres gouvernements à travers le Canada durant la crise, et avec la GRC. La GRC a travaillé avec les autres forces policières,
forces.
Ce qu'on a aperçu qu'il y avait des écarts. Il fallait travailler ensemble. Ce qu'on a fait, Madame la Présidente, avec les mesures qui n'existaient pas avant, on a donné d'autres outils aux forces policières à travers les forces de compétences dans chaque juridiction de mieux encadrer leur situation avec d'autres outils qui pourraient faire en sorte que les situations sont mieux gérées. On est en train de combler les trous, Madame la Présidente.
So we're filling in the
Honourable
gaps,
member
Madam
for
Speaker.
Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I've been here for much of the last 3 weeks, and what I've seen in Ottawa is a complete failure of civic officials and a complete failure of the police. This should never have been allowed to spiral. We saw in Quebec City and Toronto, the police did their job. We saw at the Ambassador Bridge the ridiculous situation that our bridge could be shut down for 8 days without action. So now we're having to take these measures. And I want to ask the minister, because he's talking about anti-terrorism measures. Is the government able to tell this House that they have evidence that there is terrorism and extremism, that they can justify this, or are we just having to clean up the mess for the failure of what happened here in Ottawa?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Madam Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, delivered with his usual passion in this important circumstance. Madam Speaker, I mentioned terrorism as part of the financing. This isn't a terrorism act. We took measures that had been applied to terrorism. We've applied it to other illegal activity. But I'm not equating this to terrorism. What we have done is declare a public order emergency. Based on the reasons we gave in the declaration that we have made, they include the very deleterious economic impact to the kinds of workers that the honourable member has tried to protect throughout his whole career. Think of auto workers in southwestern Ontario or Niagara. Think of beef farmers. Think of pork farmers out west whose supply chains were blocked in trading with our largest trading partner. Madam Speaker, we have declared a public order emergency based on those very serious grounds. We needed to act. We had been there from the beginning. We saw gaps. We filled them. Now we've given better tools to the police.
Debate, the Honourable Minister for Emergency Preparedness and President of the Queen's Privy Council.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it is a privilege to have the opportunity to rise today as the Minister of Emergency Preparedness to speak to the importance and necessity of the motion before the House. But Madam Speaker, let me also acknowledge that the fact that we are all in this House, that elected representatives from across Canada have come to debate this important measure, is evidence of the strength and resiliency of our democratic institutions, Madam Speaker. And although the subject of today's debate is a solemn one, I think it is also evidence that should give us strength, resolve, and hope. Madam Speaker, let me begin my remarks by acknowledging the impact that these blockades and demonstrations have had on Canadian citizens, particularly for the people of Ottawa, who have been subject to intimidation and threats, a disruption of the course of their lives that, frankly, Madam Speaker, is unacceptable. Among the most important freedoms that we covet and protect in this country is the freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly, lawful, peaceful protest. But, Madam Speaker, it's also been said, your freedom to swing your fist ends at the end of my nose. And what we have seen, unfortunately, over the past 3 weeks is those rights have been exceeded and abused to the point that it's put Canadians in harm's way. Madam Speaker, I also want to speak briefly about the impact of the blockades that were taking place at vital trade corridors in this country, our international borders. Madam Speaker, when the protesters decided to go to our borders, we need to recognize and acknowledge they were going for the throat. They were going to cut off the supply of goods and services that our country relies on. When they stopped parts from coming across that border at the Ambassador Bridge, they shuttered factories. They idled workers. They damaged the reputation of Canada as a safe and stable place to invest. They hurt Canadians. It was clearly their intent. It is clearly what they were doing. And Madam Speaker, it had to stop. And we saw the same targeted approach to hurt Canadian interest, to harm their fellow citizens in Coutts, Alberta, in South Surrey, British Columbia, in Emerson, certainly at the Ambassador Bridge, a number of feints at other points. This was not by accident. They didn't just wander into those spaces. They went for the throat of this country. And Madam Speaker, they created an emergency that we had to respond to. And Madam Speaker, for the first time, we have come to the difficult decision to invoke the authorities of the Emergency Act. And I want to assure this House, from the very outset, our government recognized the significance of this decision, the heavy responsibility that would come with pursuing it. Not just the responsibility of this government, but of this House. We approached the process with caution and with care. It was essential that we explore all options available to us, Madam Speaker. We looked at everything very closely. We looked at our existing legislation. We looked at the regulations that support the Department of Justice officials, with the support of our Department of Justice officials, to see what additional federal supports would be required. We examined existing municipal, provincial, and federal authorities. Madam Speaker, I think it's rather evident. The threat of parking tickets did not deter those trucks in Ottawa. The threat of the enforcement of the Ontario Highway Traffic Act did not deter those commercial carriers from coming down our highways and using their vehicles, which are licensed under that legislation, to cause harm to Canadians. And it has also become clear of the limitations of even the authorities enshrined within federal law and the criminal code, that our law enforcement officials were struggling. One of the things that became evident, and I'll give you two examples that I hope would be helpful to the Parliament in consideration of the necessity for these measures. One of the challenges that our law enforcement officials had, and not just our law enforcement officials, but those who are tasked with gathering and analyzing financial intelligence through FinTrack. Unfortunately, the funding associated to these actions which in many cases have been clearly criminal and harmful to Canadians, was opaque. And it became very clear when our officials came to us that they did not have the tools that they needed to provide the necessary and appropriate scrutiny of the source of that funding, and they did not have the tools to bring the accountability and even the consequences that were required to do their jobs. We listened, Madam Speaker. We listened to what they needed. We looked at the important Ontario, for example, declared an emergency and brought forward really important and useful regulations. But they couldn't do that because it was our responsibility. And so we considered that. We listened. Another example, Madam Speaker, and this may sound trivial, but it was significant. Jurisdictions right across the country. I heard from my counterpart and colleague, the minister responsible in Alberta, who for weeks has been asking for help to get tow trucks down to Coutts, Alberta, to haul those trucks away. And yet the tow truck industry in Alberta, like in Ontario, like right across the country, as a result of threats and intimidation, they were afraid to do their job. We needed that equipment, we needed those drivers, we needed their ability to remove those vehicles. But Madam Speaker, they were intimidated and afraid. And so we brought forward in these measures an authority not to compel them, but to really authorize them to do what we all needed them to be done. And Madam Speaker, I just might submit to you all, these measures work. People who knew the gaps in our laws, the gaps in law enforcement's response, they were exploiting it. And when we closed that gaps, they went to school, and we saw evidence of it in Coutts. Now, I don't want to minimize the importance of the RCMP investigation. And by the way, I'm not going to comment on any aspect of their investigation or the prosecution that will follow. It's totally inappropriate for a minister to do so. But I want to thank them for doing their job, and I want to thank God that they were able to do it safely. That eliminated part of the threat at Coutts. But when we announced on Monday that we were coming for the source of their funding, that there were going to be real consequences, financial consequences for their actions, they scurried away. And that's exactly what we needed them to do. They did exactly the same thing in Emerson, Manitoba. And even though we've seen yesterday in Windsor, some of them were going back because this is the way they can most effectively attack this country. They were stopped. They were stopped by effective law enforcement. And so, Madam Speaker, we have brought forward these measures. But let me also assure all my colleagues in this House, these measures must always be charter compliant. Our expectation is that our law enforcement officials will do their job, the job we all need them to do, but they will always do it mindful of their responsibility to uphold the rule of law, to effect their lawful purpose with a minimum amount of force, to do the work right. And I also want to assure this House, Madam Speaker, we'll be there to support them. We'll be there to support them. When they say we need tools, we'll give them the tools to do the job. And when they say we need resources, we'll provide those resources to do the job. Madam Speaker, every order of government and every person in this House has a responsibility to stand up with resolve and determination and to do what is necessary to protect Canada's interests. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
And comments, the honourable member for Sturgeon River Parker.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would note that the Deputy Director of Intelligence for FinTrack, Barry McKillop, would disagree with the Minister's suggestion that there is extremist financing of the convoy. But I'll move on to my question. Back in January through March 2020, as the Minister said, these people came for the throat. What happened to the throat of our country when our railways were being blockaded, when our pipelines were being blockaded? We couldn't even get propane to Quebec in the middle of the winter, risking the lives of so many seniors. The port of Metro Vancouver was blockaded. And now this government said we needed to initiate dialogue. We needed to work with these people to come to a peaceful resolution. What is any different with this current situation that we're facing? Why is the Emergencies Act needed?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Let me speak to the member's first point, because I heard him ask the question before, and perhaps he hasn't been satisfied with the answer. I understand. I also speak to FinTrack often, and I've worked with them for decades. They didn't have the evidence because they didn't have the tools to collect the evidence. We listened to them. They said it's opaque. We don't have the tools to examine cryptocurrency wallets, for example. And we said, we hear you. You don't have the evidence, we'll give you the tools to go collect the evidence because it's necessary to protect Canadians. So, Madam Speaker, the member's argument against these measures is clearly a little bit shallow. And he needs to recognize he's right. We didn't have that information, now we're getting that information. It's what our law enforcement officials need to protect the country.
Madame la Présidente. Madame la Présidente, on convient que la situation est sérieuse. Le problème, c'est que pendant plus de 2 semaines, il y a seule l'opposition en convenait qu'il s'agissait d'une urgence. Le premier ministre a capitulé face à ses obligations d'utiliser les recours qui étaient à sa disposition précédemment. Les Québécois et les Canadiens méritent mieux, Madame la Présidente. J'aimerais savoir si l'honorable ministre est fier d'être assis aux côtés d'un premier ministre de dernier recours.
The Honourable Minister.
I want to assure the member, not only am I proud, it is the honour of my life to be a member of this government serving Canadians. But, Madam Speaker, I also want to be very clear. We have been seized from the very first moment in supporting law enforcement's efforts, but not also the efforts of our municipal and provincial partners. We've been working closely with provincial governments right across the country, including in Quebec. And, Madam Speaker, I want to also take this opportunity, if I may, to acknowledge that we respect very much the jurisdiction of provinces and territories over policing in their jurisdiction, as I'm sure they recognize and respect our responsibility to maintain the integrity and security of our borders. Madam Speaker, all orders of government have a responsibility to protect Canadians, and we'll all work together to do it.
Honourable Member for Hamilton Centre.
Madam Speaker, I understand and share the concerns that people have about the potential long-term impacts of the use of emergency measures legislation, and in particular, as it relates to the expansion of the institution of policing, given their past abuses and overreach against legitimate political actions by Indigenous, racial and climate justice activists and workers. And yet, with the capital and country in crisis, Canadians are feeling abandoned by their local police services, who have repeatedly been caught on video, compromised, and at times seem to be working in collusion with the insurrectionist occupation. Madam Speaker, the last Royal Commission on Policing was in 1962. Will the Minister of Public Safety commit to establishing a national commission on policing that would review the duties assigned to the police and their corresponding budgets? And will the minister commit to a secretariat or some other office to report on the radicalization and use of public resources in security forces for undemocratic ends?
Minister.
Well, I thank my colleague for the question, and I think one of the things that has become quite apparent, and I've heard concern across the country as well, an overwhelming desire that the police in this country do their job, and that they do it right. Madam Speaker, that they do it in a way which is compliant with all of our laws, with our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that their response is measured, thoughtful, proportional, and effective. Madam Speaker, and we're working hard to make sure they have the tools and the support that they need. But I will also say, I spent 40 years in policing. Policing must be always accountable to the people they serve, because the most important tool that the police have is the trust and confidence of the people they serve. And Madam Speaker, we'll always work to maintain that trust and confidence.
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the Minister of Emergency Preparedness for his comments this morning. My question is with respect to what I'm hearing. I appreciated his sharing the care and caution that this is being applied with. The Prime Minister shared a more targeted approach. But I need to also reconcile that with what I'm reading in the regulations we've been provided with, mention of critical infrastructure quite broadly. I share the concerns of the member from Burnaby South, for example, with respect to how this could be applied in future to Indigenous land defenders, to climate activists. Could he clarify the difference between the more targeted approach we're hearing and the words we're seeing here?
Honourable Minister, in 30 seconds or less.
I want to thank the member for the question, and I understand the concern. I want to provide him with reassurance. These measures are time limited. They are subject to parliamentary and judicial scrutiny, and we will only use these measures as long as they are required. We recognize their extraordinary nature. They have to be subject to the scrutiny of this House. It's in the law. And we will only use them as long as they are required, and we will always ensure that they are compliant with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Unlike the Prime Minister and ministers across, it actually gives me no pleasure to rise to speak on the matter at hand. The invocation of the Emergencies Act earlier this week, for the first time in Canadian history, is a significant moment, and it's not a moment to be pleased about. It's a solemn moment. It's a moment where we have to ask ourselves, how did we get to the situation we're here in the first place? And when we examine the evidence of how we got to this situation, I don't think there's much for this government to be proud of. Now, the Conservatives thoughtfully considered the justifications written in law and given by this government for the enacting of the Emergencies Act. This government has based their justification on one provision, that a public order emergency exists throughout Canada. This claim is not supported by the evidence. Yes, we have seen border blockades in at least 4 provinces, and we have seen a persistent and now declared illegal protest in Ottawa. Before the Emergencies Act was invoked, the blockades at the borders and across Canada were lifted, or were well into the process of being lifted. So the government trying to claim credit after the fact is completely absurd. The Emergencies Act is now being used solely for the purpose of addressing the situation in Ottawa, not throughout Canada, as defined by the Act. Now, a key part of the threshold for enacting these measures is that existing laws and capabilities have proven insufficient for dealing with the problem. Madam Speaker, existing laws are well equipped to deal with these situations. They were well equipped to deal with the situation at Coutts, Emerson, at the Ambassador Bridge, and I submit that they are well equipped to be used here in Ottawa. The Minister of Justice said earlier, and the Minister of Emergency Preparedness, that they were required to pass this so they could requisition essential services like tow trucks. But it has been noted by many that under the criminal code, police already have the authority to requisition such services under pain of criminal sanction. That was before the Emergencies Act was brought in. So this argument that the Emergencies Act was necessary is completely absurd. I also want to note that I will be splitting my time with my honourable colleague from Regina Cabell. Now, the police already had the power to compel many of these services. The police already had the power to be coordinated with the RCMP, with the OPP, and the various police forces and national security forces throughout Canada. They have measures existing under the criminal code, mischief, intimidation, to be used against illegal protesters and blockades. Now, the government has used an argument where they're citing potential acts and threats of violence against Canadians and critical infrastructure. And this is not just any violence, they're saying. This is violence intended for the furtherance of an ideological and political objective. I'm very concerned with the language that this government is beginning to use, because that language is very similar to the language used under terrorism laws. The definition of terrorism is the use of violence to advance a political or ideological agenda. This government is using terrorism legislation against Canadian protesters. Wow. There is very little evidence that there was a serious threat to persons and critical infrastructure from these protests. There was a short-term risk. It was dealt with by law enforcement. I am very concerned, I'll address the member's question there, Ms. Heckel. I am very concerned about the situation that occurred around Coutts, Alberta, where a small group of militants were arrested with firearms and with the intent to do harm. I am so thankful for law enforcement, for their efforts in taking down this very real threat. And I am so confident in our law enforcement because I know they have been planning this operation for weeks. They have likely infiltrated this group. They had a plan in place, and they had the appropriate tools and expertise to deal with this dangerous situation and diffuse it before it became a very real and dangerous situation. And the fact is, Madam Speaker, that they did this before the imposition of the Emergencies Act. Clearly, they have the tools. This undermines the government's complete argument that they are justified because there were tools that were insufficient to deal with the problems. The tools have been insufficient. The threshold has not been met. I want to address some comments that have been made by this government. The Minister of Public Safety at a press conference stated very clearly and definitively that there is a connection between that militant faction at Coutts and protesters here in Ottawa. He declined to provide any evidence to back up that assertion. He was asked repeatedly by media to back up that assertion, and he failed to back up that claim. His only evidence was citing social media posts and a general tone that has been seen in protests across Canada. Now, this government has been very quick to label protesters and anyone who would oppose their political agenda. Even before the protests began, the Prime Minister called people who oppose mandatory vaccinations, which the Prime Minister did earlier in 2021, he has called them racist, misogynist, among other epithets. Now, since the beginning of the protests, the government has sought to brand and label all protesters as fringe extremists with, quote, unacceptable views. Despite this unrelenting scrutiny and rhetoric, there has still been no evidence that there are violent extremists in Ottawa. In fact, if there were, I don't know how the government could be responsible in allowing us all to be here today and walk the streets of Ottawa. It undermines their whole claim. There is no evidence that there is a plot to violently overthrow the Canadian government, despite constant repetition and saying so. I remember there was a quote from a previous Liberal minister that says, if you tell a lie big enough and loudly enough, people will totally believe it. This government is constantly saying something that they do not have the evidence to back up. And I'd like to see that evidence if they have it. We deserve to see that evidence. This act was not designed and not intended to crack down on peaceful protesters, even if they are protesting illegally. We have other laws for dealing with this. The government is citing a so-called terrorist threat, but protesters in Ottawa, it's very inconvenient, it's terrible for the people of downtown Ottawa, but honking your horns does not meet the threshold of a terrorist organization, and the government knows that. Without further evidence of a violent threat, I cannot in good conscience support the invocation of this Emergency Act. But even if I were to accept that the government has met the threshold for calling the emergency powers, I would still have serious reservations about the powers that the government says they need to deal with this situation. If they believed there was a threat to critical infrastructure and persons, which they say they believe, I could support, if they showed evidence, I could support declaring Parliament Hill and certain sensitive areas to be a no-go zone. I could accept that we need better coordination between the RCMP and local police. But what I cannot accept is the necessity of the government undermining Section 8 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees Canadians' rights from unreasonable search and seizure to have their bank accounts frozen. The Minister of Justice on a panel last night said, if you are part of a so-called pro-Trump organization, you should be worried. I think all Canadians should be worried when a Minister of Justice threatens people because of their political views. That is not the Canada that any of us want to see, and it's unacceptable, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, throughout this debate, which we are going to be having over the next number of days, Canadians will know that their official opposition is alive and well. We are prepared to stand up for Canadians' rights. We are prepared to hold this government accountable. We're going to keep fighting. We're not going to stop standing up for Canadians' rights and freedoms. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
To the Minister of Justice.
Yep. To the Honourable.
That's it. To the previous Parliament, Madam Speaker.
Sorry.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade. And I listened to the member's speech as I was actually walking over here on CPAC, and I'll respectfully, and I do want to try and reduce the tone of this debate, point out a couple of things. One is that what happened in Coutts, Alberta is extremely concerning for any Canadian, and I presume all parliamentarians that are concerned about violence. Secondly, that people, including outside of this very building, have openly called for the overthrow of a duly elected government, including an entity calling itself Canadian Unity. I think that is direct evidence of an ideological imperative or agenda that is being pursued. But the last point that I would gently point out to the member opposite is that I appreciated his submissions, and I mean that with all sincerity. But all that is being extended here with respect to laws that are already compliant with Section 8 of the Charter that relate to unreasonable search and seizure and FINTRAC is ensuring that FINTRAC can be applied to cryptocurrency and to crowdfunding sources. Is that not a necessary initiative given the foreign funding that is streaming into this country right now? If the member
for Sturgeon River Park. Parkland.
I want to thank the honourable member for that very good question, because I was at Public Safety Committee when Deputy Director of Intelligence Barry McKillop answered a question from one of his colleagues who said, why aren't we covering these crowdfunding sources? That's obviously a big loophole. And the deputy director stated that the payment processors that move the money from individuals to the crowdsourcing pages report to FINTRAC. And the Canadian banks that receive the money from the crowdsourcing efforts report to the Canadian government. He stated there are no such thing as anonymous donations because everyone must provide their name and their credit card. There are no anonymous donations. FINTRAC knows exactly who's donating, exactly where the money's going. They have the tools that they need. We do not need this further infringement on Canadians' rights and freedoms.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. J'ai écouté avec beaucoup d'attention le discours du collègue conservateur. Clairement, le Bloc et les conservateurs entendent s'opposer à l'application de la loi sur les mesures d'urgence, mais pour des raisons qui sont réellement et visiblement tout à fait différentes. Le Bloc s'y oppose parce que c'est une volonté unanime de l'Assemblée nationale du Québec et du gouvernement au pouvoir à Québec de ne pas voir le fédéral, encore une fois, s'ingérer dans ses affaires et lui imposer une loi sur les mesures d'urgence qui, on le rappelle, garde un petit goût amer à peu près à l'ensemble des Québécois, considérant ce qui s'est passé en 70. J'entendais le collègue qui parlait plutôt de l'absence de preuves qu'il existe dans les manifestations, plutôt dans l'occupation qu'on voit présentement à Ottawa, l'absence de preuves qu'il existe effectivement des éléments plus radicaux qui pourraient menacer la sécurité et des citoyens et éventuellement la sécurité nationale. Est-ce que c'est bien ce que le collègue affirme, qu'il ne croit pas qu'il y ait dans ces manifestations illégales-là des éléments qui pourraient être dangereux pour la sécurité publique? Est-ce qu'il fait confiance à ce qu'il voit sur les réseaux sociaux et à ce qu'on voit comme ces idées, par exemple, dans d'autres lieux où se déroulent des manifestations? J'aimerais qu'il précise sa pensée là-dessus, Madame la Présidente.
Member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
I want to thank the honourable member for that question. And you could go on Twitter right now and find some of the most outrageous, offensive, and criminal statements across Canada. But what we do not in this country is base the passage of laws and the invocation of emergency acts based upon the possibility of a threat. We must base it on a real threat. We must base it on evidence that there is a threat to Canadians. And the fact that we are allowed to walk freely through this parliamentary precinct with protesters less than 100 meters from us right now belies the fact that it undermines the claim that there is a serious threat to Canadian democracy. Thank you.
Member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The honourable colleague across the way, I find it very difficult. He was talking about that people were just honking their horns, and that he seemed to try and allude that this convoy was just a simple annoyance for the people in Ottawa. However, I've spoken to quite a few who are working in the downtown. I had a lovely young woman who served me lunch at a restaurant, and I asked her how she was doing. And she talked about the harassment. She talked about specific assaults. She talked about the assaults to friends of hers that were working in the market. That is what we need to address here. So I wonder if he could explain, Madam Speaker, why he seems to think that this is just a simple annoyance and why he would want to take away from the safeties of the people who are working and living in this downtown.
River Parkland.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. The member is putting words in my mouth. I'm not saying that this is a simple inconvenience for the people of downtown Ottawa. I'm not downplaying the experiences that she's telling. I believe they are true experiences. They're unacceptable experiences, and they are experiences that can be dealt with through existing laws. Harassment is a crime. Intimidation is a crime. It's up to police to enforce these measures. We do not need emergency powers to enforce existing laws. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Regina Capel.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for agreeing to share his time with me. I think it's very important for Canadians to understand that this is in no way, that the government's reaction, the government's proposal to invoke the Emergency Measures Act is in no way connected to public safety, to restoring order, or to upholding the rule of law. We know this because we know what they've done with previous protests and blockades. When the Prime Minister agrees with the aims of protesters, he does nothing. In fact, actually, it would be unfair to say he does nothing. He does nothing to end the blockades. He actually will send negotiators. He'll actually send government delegations to meet with protesters and even propose settlements and compromises when he agrees with the political aims of those protesting. We know this because in 2020, anti-energy protesters, anti-oil and gas worker protesters held up vital transportation links for weeks, Madam Speaker. At the time, the Prime Minister had a much different tone. Let's take a look at what he said when vital transportation links, when rail lines were blockaded, crippling the Canadian economy for weeks and weeks at a time. He said, and I quote, "Therefore, we are creating a space for peaceful, honest dialogue with willing partners." Compare that to the rhetoric and inflammatory language that he has used over the past several weeks here in 2022. Make no mistake, Madam Speaker, the protests that are happening in Ottawa and that have taken place across the country are a direct result of the Prime Minister's actions and his rhetoric. The demonization of people who are fighting to get their rights back. After 2 years of incredible hardship, 2 years of politicians and government agencies telling people that they weren't allowed to have family members visit them inside their own home. After 2 years of governments telling business owners that they had to keep their doors shut and their employees laid off. After years of people not able to use the various support systems that they've had in their life, relying on friends and family. Gyms closed, activities for children canceled. After 2 years of this, just as there is hope on the horizon, as other jurisdictions around the world and even here in Canada were lifting restrictions and easing mandates, the Prime Minister added a new one. He added a new restriction after 2 years of telling truck drivers that they were essential services, that they were be allowed to travel across the border to bring vital goods into our markets. After 2 years of deeming them that essential service, just as there was hope and reasons to lift restrictions and mandates, the Prime Minister added a new one without any data to back it up, without any evidence to back it up. Then when people started objecting to this, finally saying enough is enough, we want our freedoms back, Madam Speaker. It's time for the government to retreat back to the normal boundaries of government interference in our lives. When people started doing that, started to gather together to peacefully protest against government overreach, what did the Prime Minister do? He called them names, tried to smear them with broad brushes. He called them racists and misogynists. He asked the question, the rhetorical question, Madam Speaker, about whether or not we should tolerate these people. Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask the Prime Minister a question. What does not tolerating these people look like? Because what he's done over the past few weeks has just been shameful. This Prime Minister has lowered the office in which he serves to unprecedented depths. In my 17 years of being a member of Parliament, I've never seen a Prime Minister, for that matter, any other politician, so debase the office that they hold, hurling insults at people, referring to a Jewish member of this House as standing with people waving swastikas. Just outrageous, Madam Speaker. And I have to tell my honourable colleagues in the Liberal benches who have often admonished their political opponents for in any way, even sharing the same postal code as someone who may be holding an offensive flag or a placard with unacceptable language on it. And when Conservatives denounce that, that's not good enough for members of the Liberal Party. They say, you're supposed to paint the entire group protesting with that broad brush. But, Madam Speaker, they don't hold themselves to that same standard. I see many honourable members across the way, some of whom I've served with. I know them to be honourable people. I don't assume that they are all racists just because their leader has performed racist acts by putting on blackface so often in his life that he can't remember how many times he's done it. We don't paint every single Liberal member of Parliament with that brush. They have no problem being photographed with the Prime Minister, despite his history of racist acts. So neither should members of Parliament hold or paint the entire group of people who are protesting for their freedoms back with that same broad brush. The lengths at which this government, and indeed not just the government, but many of their friends in the corporate media, to paint every single person who's protesting, who's demanding an end to the restrictions, an end to mandates with that broad brush, Madam Speaker. You look at the lengths that they go to discredit and to dehumanize those people who are just fighting for their traditional civil liberties. And I ask you, Madam Speaker, if we kind of look at this in two different groups. On the one hand, you've got people who are saying after 2 years of hardship, 2 years of sacrifice, 2 years of being forced to comply with unprecedented government intrusion in our lives, unprecedented. Government's telling you where you can go, who you can have in your house. That is a new level of government interference in our life that we have not seen in recent Canadian history. After 2 years of that, there's a group of people who are saying, I just don't believe I should be fired for making a healthcare decision. Then on the other hand, you've got a group of people who are saying that anybody who holds that view is a racist, a misogynist, an insurrectionist, Madam Speaker. You've got a group of people who are saying that government should have the ability to tell you who you can have in your house, whether or not your business is allowed to stay open. Which group seems more unreasonable, Madam Speaker? I would say after 2 years, those who are fighting against this government intrusion in their lives have a legitimate case to be made. Whether or not we agree with them or not, we must respect their right to advocate for their views. The Prime Minister has not provided any legitimate justification for bringing in the Emergency Measures Act. He asks us to trust him. He says, don't worry, we're going to make sure everything's fine with the courts, we're going to make sure everything's compliant with the Charter. This is the same guy who fired his Attorney General because she wouldn't go along with his plans to interfere in a criminal court case, Madam Speaker. So you'll pardon the members of the Conservative Party if we're not going to take the Prime Minister's word that he's not going to abuse the power that he's granting himself. He points to specific incidences that Conservatives also denounced. We denounced the rail blockades in 2020, and we denounced the border blockades in 2022. Because, Madam Speaker, we do not believe that the right to peacefully protest should mean that you get to infringe on the freedom and rights of other people. But when we raised that point in 2020, calling on the government to do something about the rail blockades when it was the anti-energy workers, who, by the way, there are a lot of radical left-wing protests across the country where you see all kinds of placards, anti-Semitic placards. You see banners advocating violence committed against police officers. You don't see the government rushing to crack down on that. They're talking about foreign funding, Madam Speaker. How about the foreign funding that's poured into Canada by the hundreds of millions to help groups fight against energy projects and natural resource projects across the country? Didn't seem to bother the government then, Madam Speaker. But now all of a sudden they say that they've got to do something about it. It's a little bit like that scene in Casablanca when the inspector comes to Rick and says, sorry, I have to close the place down. There's illegal gambling going on. And then the croupier comes over and puts his winnings in his pocket. That's what this government is doing. For years, they've relied on foreign funding coming to help their allies in the political spectrum fight for their goals and fight against Canadians and their interests. So, Madam Speaker, I'm just going to close on this. This is the exact same playbook that we've seen dictatorial governments across the country. They dehumanize their opponents. They have, they invoke threats of foreign influence. Remember, the Berlin Wall was built to keep others out, ostensibly. Governments always talk about their good intentions when they take away rights and liberties. But I'm asking Canadians not to be fooled by this. And I'm asking members of the Liberal Party who actually believe in civil liberties, who actually do believe in the natural limits of government, to do the right.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Sport.
I had to just rush back into the House. I was sitting in the lobby and listening to that speech, and I just couldn't believe how willing the member from Regina Capel was to just justify all these behaviors we're seeing. I saw a video of him crossing the road this morning, giving a thumbs up and shaking hands with people who've been occupying this capital city for the last 3 weeks. And my direct question to the member is, if this was happening in Regina, if his neighbors were being occupied and harassed downtown and were afraid to leave their homes, would your position be exactly the same as it is here? Would you be giving them a thumbs up every single day?
Speak to the chair, if you don't, the honourable member for Regina Capel.
This member comes from a caucus whose leader sent a delegation to protesters. He's saying that I shouldn't wave back to people who wave to me. His government actually sent a minister with a mandate to negotiate. Madam Speaker, I'm Canadian. I'll wave at people when they wave to me. I'll say hello to people who say hello to me. When I have constituents who have left their homes to come and fight for their freedoms, I will listen to them. I will be civil. Because if the government had started off this whole thing with that type of attitude, we might not even be having this debate today, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Saint-Hyacinthe-Pagon.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Comme vous le savez, les conservateurs et le Bloc vont voter du même côté là-dessus, c'est-à-dire contre la loi sur les mesures d'urgence. Il y a quand même une chose que j'aimerais bien comprendre. En 2012, ça fait 10 ans, crise étudiante au Québec, il n'y a rien de fédéral, bien sûr. Il y avait des partisans avoués du Parti conservateur qui disaient sur les ondes de certaines radios, ah ouais, ça prend un matraque, ligne dure. Wet'suwet'en, on dirait ça fait, ça prend une intervention musclée, ligne dure. En 2020, le Bloc dépose une motion pour s'excuser auprès des victimes de la loi des mesures de guerre en octobre 70. Non, la ligne dure s'appliquait. Les conservateurs votent contre notre motion. Là arrive la crise des camionneurs. Comment ça se fait qu'à partir du moment où c'est la base des conservateurs qui est en cause, là, soudainement, ça fait pouet-pouet-pouet, puis la ligne dure se ramollit aussi vite que la calotte polaire en cette ère de changement climatique qui, quand on les écoute, n'existe pas.
Madam Speaker, my honourable colleague, first of all, I will start off my remarks by thanking the members of the Bloc Québécois, because we disagree on many things philosophically, but it's nice to know that even if we disagree on policy, that there's still some common ground on the principles about using the sledgehammer that the government's brought in. But the member is invoking a series of events that happened in 2012. Conservative Party didn't bring in the Emergency Measures Act in 2012. It's legitimate. There are going to be protests across the country, across time, where various parties are going to agree with the aims of the protests or disagree. And we can all express our opinion about whether or not those protests should be happening. But the government should not be bringing in this massive sledgehammer to crack down on dissent when there are existing laws. The Prime Minister talked about Coutts. That was resolved. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the indulgence. The Prime Minister talked about the Coutts border crossing. It was resolved with existing laws, with existing tools that law enforcement have. There's no need for this act.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Saanich Grove Highlands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Honourable Member for Regina Capel, I found his speech disturbing at many levels. There were more dog whistles to a rabid base of Trump supporters in one short speech than I've heard ever in this place. But I'd like to correct the record and ask the Honourable Member to consider that when the Government of Canada sent a delegation, it was because the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs have Supreme Court of Canada on their side, that they have a continuity of leadership, territorial responsibility that goes back to our Constitution, Supreme Court of Canada. The Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs required that both British Columbia and the Government of Canada, in the honor of the Crown, sent representatives to discuss the situation with them. They were not protesters, they were chiefs.
For Regina Capel.
Well, Madam Speaker, I believe the honourable member may be the only member of this House who's actually arrested for participating in an illegal protest. So for her to now somehow justify the Emergency Measures Act, would she have appreciated it while she was breaking laws and getting arrested if the government had the power to freeze her bank account, Madam Speaker? Would she have appreciated anybody who made a donation to the Green Party at that time having their bank accounts frozen for supporting her illegal activities, Madam Speaker? I doubt it.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Kings Heads.
Madam Speaker, I'll be sharing my time with my honourable colleague from Outremont this afternoon. Today I rise to deliver what may be the most important speech I've given since having the privilege to serve the people of Kings Heads in the House. Today, we as parliamentarians are debating whether the government's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act on Monday was justified. I submit to my colleagues in this House, and indeed all Canadians watching, that the threshold required to trigger the Emergency Act has been objectively met and perhaps exceeded. As the Prime Minister has said in this House, a decision of this nature is not taken lightly. However, the situation we have seen across the country is serious and warrants a response that is proportionate to the impact we have seen on all Canadians. Let me be very clear. I am in full support of legal protests in this country. It is a constitutionally protected right, and indeed I have spoken to some of my own constituents who in their own way have demonstrated their displeasure with the government's protocols to date. However, we have to delineate between lawful protest and individuals who refuse to abide by the rule of law, who have occupied Ottawa and who have blockaded our key border crossings. I believe it's incumbent on all of us to look at the facts and to try to be objective. We have seen a group of individuals in Ottawa who have occupied the city for now 3 weeks. This despite orders from law authorities to disperse and to go home. The key organizers of the Ottawa occupation have openly espoused their goal of overthrowing the government, of meeting with the Governor-General to form a coalition. We've had blockades across the country at key border crossings, which have targeted the country's trade relationship, including at Windsor, Coutts, and Emerson. At Coutts, the RCMP have found weapons and body armor. How can one conclude that this was simply a peaceful protest? The Minister of Public Safety outlined to this House this morning what the impact was having across the country economically. Hundreds of millions of dollars a day in economic harm, blocking critical infrastructure, critical trade routes that hurts everyday Canadians. It impacts our food security and our supply chain. There has been a targeted impact of the Ottawa International Airport, and the organizers of the Freedom Convoy have expressed their desire to reestablish blockades and occupations elsewhere, even if they were taken down by police. We also know that these activities are being financed by international sources. I ask members of these House, do we as parliamentarians have a responsibility to take action on internationally financed activities to organizers of activity that is not only illegal, but indeed represents a threat to Canadian security and the rule of law? I, for one, believe we do. I want to be crystal clear. This is being done to target activities that are illegal and threatening the economic health of the country and the rule of law and order. For those whose intent is to raise issues about government policy, I have no issue. For those who continue to be a part of illegal blockades here in Ottawa or elsewhere, you do not have the ability to do so, and these measures are being implemented because of your unwillingness to abide by the law. So what is the public emergency order being invoked under the Emergencies Act? What does it actually mean? The Conservatives would have you believe this government is limiting all freedoms. These measures do not take away freedoms. The Bloc would suggest that this is akin to the War Measures Act and are seeking to drum up memories of the FLQ crisis. This is not the War Measures Act. It is not taking away the rights of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and it is not calling in the Army. This is a specific measure to give additional powers to police and provincial authorities to maintain law and order, monitor the financing, including from foreign sources, that is being used to block and undermine critical infrastructure, and to ultimately remove the blockades and occupations that exist across the country. Let's examine the actual measures in the order. The regulation and prohibition of public assemblies that lead to a breach of the peace and go beyond lawful protest. I want to be clear, lawful protests can continue. Designated and securing places where blockades are to be prohibited. Directing persons to render essential services to relieve impacts of blockades on Canada's economy. So this could include things like tow trucks, Madam Speaker, that could be requisitioned, of course, for compensation by government authorities to help removing trucks and vehicles that are blockading key infrastructure. Authorizing or directing financial institutions to render essential services that relieve the impact of blockades, including regulating and prohibiting the use of property to fund and support the blockades that are undermining economic security in the country. Measures enabling the RCMP to enforce municipal bylaw and provincial offences where required, and the imposition of fines under Section 19 of the Emergencies Act. I submit to this House that these measures are specific, they are time-limited, and geographically focused. The measures will be overseen by a joint parliamentary committee and of course must be supported by a majority in this House to remain in force. I have previously mentioned that policing is in the domain of municipalities and the provincial government. Madam Speaker, since day one, our government was and continues to work directly with municipal and provincial authorities and their law enforcement. We've answered calls for additional resources. We helped create integrated operations and additional RCMP officers to try and deal with blockades. Leading into Monday's decision, it was clear that the provincial and municipal authorities were being unable to address the situation. Ironically, members of this House were calling us to show federal leadership. Some Conservatives, after openly encouraging illegal activity to continue, and were asking the government to stop the blockades. Well, these measures are designed to do exactly that. My question to members in this House who are criticizing the government for making available time-limited tools under the Emergencies Act to support law enforcement, what intermediate step would you suggest the government should have undertaken? Beyond asking the Prime Minister to meet with individuals who fly flags that say F-U-C-K, Trudeau, and want to overthrow a democratically elected government and have stated that they will not leave until their demands are met. What security measures would you have suggested this government should have undertaken? That is the key question. As my constituents, Madam Speaker, have rightfully pointed out, it is easy to be an armchair critic, but I have yet to hear much constructive measures on the other side of the House on how to deal with the current situation. Madam Speaker, I support the government's measures. They are reasonable, they are balanced, and they are proportionate to the circumstances we have seen. They are focused on giving tools to police in jurisdictions across the country to resolve illegal blockades that are hurting everyday Canadians. And I think it's extremely important for all of us to remember that these are tools that are available. This order is in effect for 30 days. This is to make sure that we have the ability to address the circumstances that we've seen. I would hope that all members of this House believe that this is an important measure so that we can make sure that the blockades, the economic harm, and frankly, the lack of rule and order that we've seen in certain elements of this country do not continue. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I look forward to taking questions from my honourable colleagues.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Edmonton West.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech today. Earlier we heard from one of his colleagues that the government says they know what a lawful protest looks like. I'm wondering why the government then did not act when we had protesters blockading Via Rail, CN Rail, blocking the Port of Vancouver, crippling our economy and crippling pipelines and oil and gas transfer to the point that Alberta companies are offering to truck propane to Quebec. Why is that considered a lawful protest, not to be subject to such extreme draconian acts that the government is bringing in now compared to what's going on right now?
Member for Kings Heads.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I anticipated the question because I've noticed on this side of the House, on the opposite side, that the members are trying to create that narrative. In fact, I find they've been inconsistent in their own way in the fact that they were very quick to call on government action back in 2020 and were silent for nearly 2 weeks on what we've seen in Ottawa and elsewhere in the country. The difference for me, Madam Speaker, of why this rises to the level of the Emergency Act is the fact that there has been an open, stated goal of those that have been involved in the protest to actually overthrow government and to cause disruption and harm to Canadians. I will go on record and say it is absolutely unacceptable, regardless of the motions or the notion and desire of protesters to block critical infrastructure. I support measures that do that, including in this way here today.
Député de Thérèse de Blainville.
The honourable member for Thérèse de Blainville.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. J'aimerais d'abord dire que je suis profondément et totalement en désaccord avec la loi sur les mesures d'urgence, d'où le débat d'aujourd'hui. Contrairement aux collègues qu'on vient d'entendre et au premier ministre qu'on a entendu en début de matinée, en qualifiant cette loi de proportionnelle et de raisonnable, je la trouve complètement disproportionnée et déraisonnable. J'aimerais poser la question suivante à mon collègue. Quand vous dites quelles mesures intermédiaires auraient été mises en place, j'aimerais lui poser la question, pourquoi, dès le départ, n'avez-vous pas mis en place des mesures tant politiques que de sécurité publique au lieu de laisser s'installer le blocus qu'on connaît maintenant devant la colline parlementaire?
The honourable member for Kings Heads.
Madam Speaker, in the absence of federal government leadership, ordinary people, brave as they may be, put themselves in harm's way because of this government. Protecting the people is the cornerstone of the contract between citizens and the government. Does the government understand the consequences of its lack of leadership? That was from the critic from the Bloc Québécois 4 days ago. What do they expect federal government leadership to look like? Do they suggest that it looks like what the Conservatives are calling for, that the government just simply does as those outside Wellington are asking for and just eliminate any public health measure related to COVID? What we are doing is very simple. We are giving tools to local law authorities, including in Quebec, to use at their discretion to avoid what we've seen across the country. Would the member opposite think that it is a good idea to have those tools available such that if there was a blockade at Lacal, that is not something that we can do to be able to address that situation? And it's ironic because they say, why didn't this happen at the time? The reality is it has to work its way to a federal level, which it has over the past 3 weeks. Had we intervened at the first time, they would have been the same party to say that it was an overstep and to respect provincial jurisdiction. It is hypocrisy.
Member for Timmins James Bay.
Speaker, having been in Ottawa for most of this blockade, what I've seen is a complete lack of willingness of the police to do their job. This should never have spiraled. This was allowed to metastasize and create a crisis at our borders, cutting off hundreds of millions of dollars of trade. I remember when the Conservatives were saying that if 10 unvaccinated truckers didn't get to cross the border, we'd have all our supply lines and our stores shut down. When that didn't happen, their supporters actually shut the border. But I'd like to ask the honourable member, now that we're at this point, it does speak to the absolute failure of this government to have shown leadership throughout. We should never be in a situation where we're using the Emergency Act against people who are setting up hot tubs on Wellington Street because of the lack of rule of law.
For Kings Hansen, 15 seconds or less.
I'll try to be very quick. The member talks about leadership. What type of leadership would he like to see? Would he like to see a federal government overreach in the first few days of imposing federal powers? Would the member suggest that leadership looks like acquiescing to what the Conservatives have said? No, what we've done is we've waited until the situation warranted a federal response. Here we are. We're putting tools in place to be able to address the situation. It's a bit of a nothing question in my mind. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Tourism, Assistant Minister of Finance.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Et le débat que nous tenons aujourd'hui est crucial. Et j'aimerais m'adresser ici à tous les membres dans cette Chambre, bien entendu, mais également aux Canadiens à travers le pays. Cette semaine, le gouvernement du Canada a déclaré l'état d'urgence. C'est une décision qui n'a pas été prise à la légère. Et pour cause. Invoquer la loi sur les mesures d'urgence n'est pas la première chose que le gouvernement du Canada devrait faire, ni même la deuxième, Madame la Présidente. C'est une solution de dernier recours. Mais force est d'admettre que cette avenue est maintenant nécessaire. Les blocages illégaux érigés à travers le pays au cours des 3 dernières semaines ont perturbé la vie de beaucoup trop de Canadiens. Ces blocages ont causé des dommages importants à notre économie et à nos institutions démocratiques. Des emplois et la prospérité du Canada sont en jeu. À cause des gestes illégaux qui ont été posés, la confiance internationale envers le Canada comme endroit propice aux investissements est aujourd'hui ébranlée, Madame la Présidente. Nous ne pouvons pas rester les bras croisés alors que le gagne-pain des Canadiens, des travailleurs, est menacé, alors que les entreprises, petites et grandes, sont affectées par ces blocages à travers le pays. We cannot and we will not let Canada's reputation on the international stage be tarnished. That's why we are taking action. The Emergency Economic Measures Order will allow the government to take concrete steps, concrete action to stop the financing of the illegal blockades. The main objective of these measures is to limit the flow of money that is used to finance this unlawful activity and to prevent additional financial support. As the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance has said before, this is about following the money. 2 broad categories of financial measures are being enacted. First, those aimed at crowdfunding platforms and payment service providers, and second, those applicable to Canadian financial service providers. Let's look at the first one. Crowdfunding platforms and some payment service providers are not currently subject to the anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing laws that we have in this country. It therefore stands to reason that they could be used to finance unlawful activities such as the blockades that we are seeing. To address this, the order extends the scope of Canada's anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing rules to cover crowdfunding platforms and the payment processors that they use. Specifically, the entities that are in possession of any funds associated with the illegal blockades are now required to register with FINTRAC, the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada, and to report suspicious and large value transactions of persons involved in the blockades. This will mitigate the risks that these platforms could be used to receive funds from illicit sources or to finance illicit activity. Second, with respect to our financial service providers, the order directs them to intervene when they suspect that an account belongs to someone participating in the illegal blockades. This means that banks, insurance companies, and other financial service providers must now temporarily cease providing financial services, including freezing their accounts when they believe an account holder or client is engaged in illegal blockades. The order applies to all funds held in a deposit, in a checking, or in a savings account, and to any other type of property. This also includes digital assets, such as cryptocurrencies. As a result, Canadian financial service providers are now able to immediately freeze or suspend an account of an individual or business affiliated with these illegal blockades, and to do so without a court order, Madam Speaker. Financial service providers are also protected against civil liability for the actions that they take to comply with the order. Of course, these service providers are required to unfreeze accounts when the account holder stops assisting or participating in the illegal blockades. Avec le décret sur les mesures économiques d'urgence, le gouvernement ordonne aussi aux institutions financières canadiennes d'examiner leurs relations avec toute personne impliquée dans les blocages illégaux. Ce décret confère également aux institutions gouvernementales fédérales, provinciales et territoriales un nouveau pouvoir, celui d'échanger des renseignements pertinents avec les banques et les autres fournisseurs de services financiers si ces renseignements contribuent à mettre un terme au financement des blocages illégaux et des activités illicites ici au Canada. Madame la Présidente, la grande majorité des Canadiens, ceux qui respectent les lois et qui ne participent pas à ces blocages illégaux, ne verront aucune différence. Ce décret ne changera rien pour eux. Ces mesures visent à mettre fin au financement qui permet les blocages illégaux. Ce sont des mesures ciblées et temporaires. Elles s'appliqueront pendant 30 jours et visent les individus et les entreprises qui participent directement ou indirectement à des activités illicites qui nuisent à notre économie et à notre peuple. Ce sont des mesures qui sont nécessaires, Madame la Présidente. Il est vrai que les blocages n'ont lieu dans que certaines régions du pays, ça on le sait, mais ils nuisent à toute l'économie canadienne. Il est aussi vrai que la plupart des régions au pays n'ont pas été le théâtre de ces activités illicites. Mais le financement qui a permis ces gestes illicites ne vient pas seulement des quartiers où les semi-remorques ont été stationnés. Ça vient de partout. Qui plus est, certains individus ont traversé les frontières interprovinciales pour participer à ces activités. Des activités, Madame la Présidente, que je souligne sont illégales. Nos institutions démocratiques sont menacées. L'économie canadienne est menacée. La paix, l'ordre et la bonne gestion publique sont menacés au Canada. C'est inacceptable. Nous devons en finir et nous allons en finir. Madam Speaker, the message is clear. From the finance perspective, if people are funding blockades that harm the Canadian economy, their bank account will be frozen. If people that fund blockades think that they can get around the law by using cryptocurrencies, that won't work. If a company's truck is used in illegal activity, the vehicle's insurance will be suspended, and the company's bank accounts will be frozen. Semi-trailers, they should be on our roads, Madam Speaker, not parked for weeks on end in front of Parliament. They should be delivering the goods and the services that will grow our economy, not holding up traffic at border crossings or paralyzing our city centers. Cela dit, Je demeure optimiste, Madame la Présidente. Je demeure optimiste que le droit sera restauré sous peu et que les blocages seront démantelés. Je demeure optimiste que nous allons en finir avec cette pandémie tout en étant là les uns pour les autres. Et je demeure optimiste que nous pouvons renforcer notre économie, pas à coups de klaxons, mais grâce au travail acharné de nos entrepreneurs, de nos petites et grandes entreprises, et par des politiques économiques réfléchies et responsables. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Before we go to questions and comments, I believe the Honourable Member for Regina-Capel has a point of order.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to clarify the record. I misspoke during my questions and comments in response to the member for Sandwich Gulf Islands. I indicated that she was the only member of this House to have been arrested for protesting illegally. I, of course, completely forgot the image of the Minister of the Environment in his orange jumpsuit. He, too, was arrested for illegal protest. And I don't
Noted. The Honourable Member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
To the Honourable Member for Regina-Capel, I would like to retain the honour of being the only Member of Parliament currently serving as a Member of Parliament when I faced arrest non-violently, surrendering immediately, and accepting the consequences, unlike our friends outside.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville. She's been waiting for a long time.
Thank you, Madam. The individual who just spoke indicated that one of the problems here is that Canada's reputation is being tarnished by this. And I would ask her, whose reputation is truly being tarnished? Canadians' reputations or this government's reputation? The stands of everyday Canadians that have been taken have gained international support and have drawn disdain directly towards the Liberal government and especially the language and actions of this Prime Minister.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I'm sure it will come as no surprise, Madam Speaker, that I entirely disagree. I think that there are many people that have fallen to how can I say, Canadians have lost confidence in many different institutions as a result of what has been happening over the course of the last 3 weeks. Top of mind is the police. I believe that many Canadians right across the country question whether law enforcement was there, and this Emergency Measures Act provides more tools to our police force in order to maintain confidence in law and order in this country.
Honorable député de
Mirabel. La présidente, la collègue a bien mentionné que son gouvernement ne laisserait pas la réputation du Canada être ternie par les événements. Présentement, le drapeau qui lui est si cher est devenu un symbole d'extrême droite et de désordre partout sur Terre, Madame la Présidente. J'aimerais savoir, étant donné que son discours semble avoir été écrit il y a 3 semaines, si l'honorable collègue a de l'aide avec son agenda.
Does she help with her agenda? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Canada's flag is the flag of all Canadians and of all Quebecers, and I wear it proudly every day. I'd like to answer my colleague because I didn't really understand his very strange question. I'd like to also stress that I see that Quebecers agree with the application of the Emergencies Act. In fact, more than 70% of Quebecers approve the invocation of this act, Madam Speaker, and I am proud to represent them. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I first would like to say that I hold this government responsible for letting these extreme right convoy members into the downtown area. But I'd like to understand there is a collective memory of Quebecers when the War Measures Act was invoked. Today, we cannot compare what was happening at the time to what's happening today. Fundamental rights are being protected and there is a time limitation. Does this reassure my colleague? Because all parliamentarians will have powers to guarantee limits. Madam Speaker, I find myself agreeing entirely with my colleague from Rosemont. We're talking here about a totally different act. The Emergencies Act is not at all the same as the War Measures Act that was used in 1970. We're not sending soldiers to the ground, and I agree that there is transparency and powers for all parliamentarians to end the application of this act. Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I noticed today some very interesting public opinion polling coming out of Quebec. As a matter of fact, it says that 72% of Quebecers support the use of the Emergency Measures Act. More importantly, Abacus data that's been released recently say that 63% of Bloc supporters in the last election would never vote for an MP that supports the occupation going on outside. Yet the Bloc seems to be showing their support for the occupation. I'm wondering if the Parliamentary Secretary, can provide some insight into that.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, I think I will address this question in French with the permission of my colleague. Et je suis d'accord,
and I agree, as I said earlier, that the vast majority of Quebecers are in favor of applying this act. And I would also say that the approval rating is even higher in Quebec than the rest of the country. So, yes, I do think that we have to be very cautious when we're talking on behalf of Quebecers, like the other side of the House is saying, as members of the Bloc.
Debate, the Honourable Member for Kamloops, Thompson Caribou.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I will be splitting my time for remarks with the Honourable Member from South Surrey, White Rock. Madam Speaker, it's an honor to rise on behalf of the citizens of Kamloops, Thompson Caribou, not only in this House generally, but in such important times. And sometimes we do forget what a tremendous honor it is. I'm sad, though, to be here discussing emergency measures here today. This has been a time, with respect, where the Prime Minister has inflamed, has incited, and has divided. The Prime Minister took that same inflammatory approach yesterday when he spoke in response to a question from the member from Thornhill. I was dismayed that he would not apologize or did not apologize for that today. Instead, he came into this House this morning and doubled down on years of division. So let's recap. The predecessor legislation was invoked 3 times: World War I, World War II, and the FLQ crisis. The Prime Minister invites and likes for Canadians to think that he's the common person. So I'm not sure if he has walked through downtown Ottawa of late, but I did yesterday and today, and I saw trucks in streets. There were a few streets that were plugged, and those trucks need to go, period. The question then becomes, how should that be done? Now, I took an oath when I was sworn in, and it was the greatest days of my life, to take that oath on behalf of all Canadians, and particularly on behalf of the residents of Kamloops, Thompson Caribou. And I took my oath to do my job to the best of my ability. I have to be satisfied as a legislator that the preconditions for this act have been met. That is my job. That is the oath I took, and that is something that I take very seriously. So I read the act, and I considered it. I actually had to read it twice. I've practiced law for 14 years, Madam Speaker. I previously taught at a law school for a number of years. So when it came to my analysis of the act, I did what I taught my students to do. I went back to first legal principles, first statutory principles, and we apply legal principles and statutory principles, not because it is popular, not because we want the trucks to be cleared in any way possible, but because we here, 338 of us, must apply the law. After all, the Prime Minister has made the same remarks about the rule of law. He wouldn't strip Canadians of citizenship just because it was popular.
just because people may like it, but instead we must accede to the rule of law. So let's apply the rule of law, Madam Speaker. Let's apply the legislation here. This legislation is clear. It says that its application must be the last resort. Members of this House have repeatedly asked, what was step one? Crickets. What was step two? Crickets. The police weren't even stopping people carrying jerry cans in. What was step three? More crickets. Word salad. The official leader of the opposition asked the Prime Minister to attend a meeting with all party leaders with a view to bringing this matter to an end, and by my count, that was about 10 days ago. Crickets. Even without the Emergencies Act application, which is alive right now, Madam Speaker, protesters could be arrested under the current regime. There are laws about causing a disturbance, mischief, and participation in these sorts of illegal activities. The Criminal Code is very clear on that, and I'm not even touching on the Ontario Highways Traffic Act. The trucks could be seized incidental to arrest as evidence. They could be seized with a warrant. All things that the police have at their disposal right here, right now, to address the very situation that the Emergencies Act says it will deal with as a last resort. These first resorts have not been addressed. So let's next look, Madam Speaker, at what was resolved without the use of the Emergencies Act. Coutts, the Ambassador Bridge, Windsor. Why? Because the police had the powers to do so and used those powers. My point, Madam Speaker, is this. The legislation says that we do not resort to its use unless it is absolutely necessary. And what we have seen in these three instances I just mentioned is that it is not absolutely necessary. And as a legislator, I need to be convinced that the threshold has been met, or I will not vote for such legislation. I wish we could simply invoke legislation to make our problems go away. That's just not the case, Madam Speaker. It can't be done as a measure of convenience. Let's not forget, this wasn't done during 9/11. This wasn't done during COVID. This wasn't done during railway blockades that had crippling impact on our economy and economic consequences. This wasn't done throughout many protests throughout the country. This wasn't done when BC highways and rail were washed out due to recent flooding. I recently received an inquiry from a constituent in the North Thompson area near Blue River in my riding. There have been protests in that area for years, and Blue River is a small community. Violence, threats, blockades. And I told that constituent what I am telling this House. The legislation is a last resort to be used in extraordinary circumstances of national emergency when nothing else will do. As one of the members for Ottawa here said earlier today, this has been going on for 4 weeks, and I echo that sentiment. I understand that it's been going on for 4 weeks, and those committing illegal activity need to stop. It has been going on for much longer in my riding, and those people are asking the same questions. Now, in closing, Madam Speaker, I will say this. I do agree with the Prime Minister on one point, and he did say that he is trying to save jobs. Unfortunately, I would eliminate the plural. He's trying to save one job, his own, and that is not right. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I welcome the member to the House as a new member, but also as a fellow member of the Bar. I'll politely point out that an emergency was not...
Could I ask that the people who are outside of the chamber please stop speaking so loudly? We can barely hear ourselves here. Thank you. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
So I welcome the new member, also welcome him as a fellow member of the bar. He indicated he's read the statute. He knows full well that in terms of COVID, enacting a public welfare emergency requires the provinces to initiate such a request. No request is forthcoming. Secondly, he asked for what steps have been taken. The first step was actually the City of Ottawa declaring an emergency, which didn't render the results. The second step was the province of Ontario declaring an emergency, which hasn't rendered results. The last step, the final step, is this very important debate that we're having today. And I'm going to put to him an issue about the capability of the province under its authorities to deal with it, which I think is squarely an issue, because the provincial order that has been made by Premier Ford fails in two important respects. It does not compel essential workers like tow trucks to actually tow vehicles away. And secondly, it cannot compel vehicle licenses to be suspended where that vehicle originates in another province, such as one of the Western provinces. Are those not instances of a lack of provincial authority which necessitates the usage of the Emergencies Act in this case?
Member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Well, the criminal code actually deals with all of those issues. And when the honourable member speaks about the invocation of a state of emergency, I didn't see a single thing change. He's right. I didn't see a single thing change. I didn't see any enforcement change. What was step one? What was step two? We can't simply do this because we don't like how something is being enforced. It should be a matter of last resort. And those steps are available in the criminal code, whether it comes to seizure, to search, or to seizure and arrest with warrant. So with respect, I disagree.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie mon collègue pour son discours. Plusieurs choses que je suis en accord, effectivement. On a entendu le Premier ministre ce matin énoncer qu'il y a eu plusieurs solutions et que la loi des mesures d'urgence est la dernière solution de dernier recours. On ne connaît pas la première mesure, la deuxième, la troisième mesure. J'aimerais poser à mon collègue la question suivante. Un gouvernement qui est incapable d'assurer la sécurité vis-à-vis des manifestations et des camionneurs, est-ce que ce même gouvernement-là mérite un siège au Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies? Merci.
The honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
I would thank the honourable minister for his remarks. I look forward to someday hopefully being, pardon me? Oh, sorry, did I say minister? Honourable member, I misspoke. I thank the honourable member for his remarks. The Prime Minister declared Canada is back when he was first elected. The problem is this. You can say anything you want to say, but at the end of the day, it's actions that people will judge. And when people look at actions, they look at integrity. And we have a Prime Minister that, with respect, has not displayed a great deal of integrity, whether it comes to ethical breaches or it comes to a deliberate desire to divide, both in this House, but also with respect to Canadians. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Hamilton Centre.
Madam Speaker, we're seeing growing escalations. This situation is clearly out of control due to the lack of leadership from all levels of government. In addition to the firearms and arrests for conspiracy to commit murder in Coutts, an attempted arson of a residential building in the occupation area, convoy members have been deputizing themselves and now claim they have the lawful authority to detain and arrest others. Madam Speaker, I don't recall the honourable member mentioning the seriousness of the violent terror cell apprehended at Coutts on conspiracy to commit murder. No one wants to see someone get hurt here, yet this is a recipe for disaster. Does the honourable member and the Conservatives not view this situation as an emergency?
For Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
I'm very clear here. When we talk about the legislation, has the threshold been met? Simply saying, do you review it this way colloquially, isn't the question that is before this House. The question, Madam Speaker, that's before this House is, has the threshold been met? And with respect, I don't believe it has been, because I don't view this as the act of last resort. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for South Surrey, White Rock.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It is a somber time in this House to be speaking. It is a seminal time in Canadian history, in my view. It is apparent to me that we seem to be living in two Canadas. There is the Canada of fear and division promoted by the current Prime Minister and the leader of the NDP, confirmed by their caucuses. But there's another Canada out there, a united and proud nation that has sacrificed and done without and suffered economically, physically, and in their mental health condition. This is a Canada that is a bit worn out, plainly speaking, but still firmly patriotic and ready to take on whatever the future brings. They are Canadians who do not share this PM's post-national narrative and embrace the essence of Canada that they see themselves as a part of, as the true North, strong and free. In our national anthem, we call out to God and we pray that He keep our land glorious and free. The truth is that Canada can only be glorious if it is free, meaning its people are free, free from tyranny, free from government abusing its awesome powers, mindful of the responsibility and trust given to it in a representative democracy. Because this Prime Minister wants to dwell in the extreme, infringe and false narratives of what is happening during peaceful protests, I am choosing to address those other Canadians. I remember the historical term, the two solitudes, Mr. Speaker, in reference to impasses between Anglophone and Francophone people in Canada. Its meaning was meant to refer to a perceived lack of communication and, moreover, a lack of will to communicate. Here today we see history repeating itself, Madam Speaker. A lack of communication, but more significantly, a lack of will to communicate between the present federal government and Anglophone and Francophone citizens alike. The Emergency Act is extraordinary legislation. Extraordinary means remarkable, exceptional, unusual, and uncommon. The measures in this act are to be entered into reservedly, advisedly, and with extreme caution. Through all the trials and tribulations of a newly created and burgeoning nation, trying to unite coast to coast to coast, through other public health emergencies, through other civil unrest, our federal government saw fit to invoke the Emergency Act and its precursor, the War Measures Act, only 4 times in our history. These extraordinary measures were used in World War I, World War II, Prime Minister Trudeau I, and Prime Minister Trudeau II. Excuse me. World War I, World War II, a previous Prime Minister in the 1970s and the current Prime Minister. It was not invoked, Madam Speaker, during the fears and protests around the Spanish flu. It was not invoked during the workers' strikes in the 1930s, not invoked during the crises in Oka or Ipperwash or Caledonia, during the aftermath of 9/11, during crippling national strikes affecting our supply chains, during the rail blockades or pipeline protests, also negatively affecting the Canadian economy. The list is long, Madam Speaker. The point is, where other methods and authorities exist to deal with serious disagreement, government should use those methods and authorities. Government should not subjugate free people to abusive, wide-ranging, freedom-altering overreach of government. A Liberal member asking a question earlier in this debate said to the Leader of the Opposition, well, what if this happened in your neighbourhood, in your riding? Well, it did happen in my neighbourhood, Madam Speaker, and in my riding. It happened at one of the border crossings in South Surrey White Rock. I received many reports on the ground about the activities there. I did have 3 complaints through national media calling the people involved the same outrageous, inflammatory names that the Liberal Party and the Prime Minister have been using. There were no complaints to my office. On the other side, I have had overwhelming outpourings of support from my constituents because the supporting protests were meaningful to those in attendance, and even joyful in hope for change. What kind of change? Not necessarily a change in government, although that might happen in the next federal election, but most definitely a change in federal government approach. On 2 previous weekends, vehicle after vehicle in support of the right to protest, this government's policies, actions, and inactions drove in a rolling loop around those border crossings and highways in South Surrey, with thousands, not hundreds, thousands of Canadians cheering them on from the sides of the roads and on highway overpasses. Those involved were vocal but peaceful, holding high Canadian flags, singing the national anthem, saying prayers, and greeting others cheerfully, including the police. The result, Madam Speaker, is that the border has been cleared. Goods are flowing, and the police, using tools already at their disposal, were able to show both respect for the protesters and clear any impasses. Why is the Emergencies Act needed now in my riding? It isn't. The only distress being expressed right now from my riding is that the Prime Minister and his cabinet are showing disdain, having inflamed the situation, are not even attempting to engage in dialogue, and saw the only tool in their toolbox to be taking more power unto themselves. I have heard from many civil enforcement officers, civil liberties scholars, and lawyers on this subject, Madam Speaker. Collectively, they want me to remind the House that a public order event is not necessarily an emergency. We are down to a protest in a few blocks of downtown Ottawa. That's all. With some proper policing, the situation in Ottawa can be brought to a conclusion, as it has been elsewhere. Unlike some of the other events in downtown Ottawa, our nation's capital, we're not at a U.S. border, so it does not affect imports and exports. I'm not sure who the leader of the NDP was referring to when he said, "Don't let your anger turn into hatred." The Prime Minister has turned his back literally on a large segment of Canadian citizens, showing them nothing but derision and disdain. This only escalates, never de-escalates, tension and disagreement. I had occasion, Madam Speaker, early in my career to attend advanced negotiation classes at Harvard Law School under the supervision of Professor Roger Fisher, the author of the acclaimed book titled Getting to Yes. There are necessary steps that should be taken in any conflict resolution. Some form of engagement, de-escalation, respectful dialogue, looking to best alternatives to resolve the conflict, short of the only one the PM has employed, which has been described as the nuclear option. I agree that we should never have been at this moment looking like a failed nation state. We are looking this way due to weak and ineffective leadership. It is that simple. Why invoke this act now when it was not invoked all those times before? The federal government should be talking to and engaging with citizens to resolve this conflict by introducing a plan to get back to normal. Instead, we have seen the federal government demonize and insult our fellow Canadians. Remember, Prime Minister, they are all Canadians out there on Wellington Street, and a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. I'm pretty sure I heard that somewhere before. Instead of creating a plan, engaging in dialogue, and looking for a peaceful solution, the Prime Minister is looking to invoke and stoke more fear and division. Countries around the world and Canadians themselves at home are looking at this and wondering, is this my Canada? Is this the Canada I have believed in patriotically, firmly, and with a full heart for so long? The truth is that the Prime Minister and the government initiated these protests by Canadians by calling them down in the first place and then not dealing with it as it unfolded. I think back to a former leader of the Progressive Conservative Party that went along with the former Prime Ministers who invoked the War Measures Act, and then for the third time in Canadian history, and not during wartime, Madam Speaker. He voted for that War Measures Act. His name was Robert Stansfield. He later said it was the greatest regret of his life that he voted with the government that day. Edmund Burke is often quoted, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing." Well, I stand against this measure with every fiber of my being. I will vote no. This is a free country. and its people should be free to protest, free to exercise their given human rights, and we need to respect and engage them. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I respect the member opposite a great deal and served with her on the Justice Committee in the last Parliament. I would just simply put it to her, because I've heard this narrative throughout the debate thus far, that the tools are no longer necessary, for example, vis-a-vis blockades at borders, because the blockades have been cleared. And I would put to her a few simple facts, just simply one lawyer to another, that we know that there was an attempted resurrection of a blockade at Windsor just yesterday, and the Windsor Police used the tools under the Emergencies Act to their benefit to prevent and thwart that quickly. We also know that protesters who have threatened to take up arms have openly declared that they will be returning to Quebec City on February 19th in front of the Assemblée Nationale. And we know the type of arms that were seized at Coutts. Does not these threats and ongoing threats merit the necessity of using a federal power, including the Emergencies Act, to deal with what is an ongoing, current and future situation in this country? Merci.
The Honourable Member for South Surrey White Rock.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my friend opposite. I also have great respect for his intellect and abilities, and yes, I apologize to all Canadians, we are both lawyers. But having said that, we are now members of Parliament, and as well. And with great respect, I do not think it should have ever come to this. I believe the Prime Minister and the government should have engaged in respectful dialogue, should have at least signaled out an understanding that we can have differences of opinion in a free country, and those differences are being listened to. And if the government had acted on our opposition motion to table a plan of action, all of this would have calmed down immeasurably.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I certainly agree this should never have come to this. The fact that a protest was allowed to become an occupation speaks to failures at every single level. But the problem I really have with my honourable colleague and what her party's saying is, you know, if the Prime Minister had just gone out and talked to the nice protesters, everything would have been settled. When Pat King, an organizer for them, the spokesperson, said this is going to be settled with bullets, a line is crossed. And I know the fact that he's talking about shooting the Prime Minister may not seem like a problem, but it should be a problem. It should be a problem to every parliamentarian. I will not negotiate with anyone who talks about shooting a Prime Minister of this country. They need to start addressing these issues.
Honourable Member for South Surrey White Rock.
Well, I thank my colleague for the question, and with all due respect, the police and law enforcement authorities in this country deal with threats, deal with violence every single day. They deal with it effectively, they deal with it forcefully, and they deal with it definitively. Our Crown prosecutors make sure that those people come to justice. The expression that's coming to my mind, Madam Speaker, is, "O ye of little faith." Why do you have such little faith in the people who are tasked with keeping us safe? You don't need these extraordinary measures.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honorable député de Drummond.
Honourable Member for Drummond.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Je ne pensais pas faire ça un jour, mais je vais faire un peu de surf, comme on dit en espagnol, sur ce que le collègue de Timmins, James Bay, vient de dire.
Add on to what the member for Timmins, James Bay just said. At what point do the Conservatives recognize that there is a real threat, that the police visibly don't have the means to contain? At what point will there be an admission that the evidence is there? Seized weapons in Coutts, veiled threats, and not so veiled threats, literally, on social media. So I would like my colleague to tell me what more evidence is needed that the police cannot contain this occupation here in Ottawa. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for South Surrey White Rock.
Thank you, my colleague, for the question. It would be really refreshing to actually have real evidence connecting these dots. The Minister for Emergency Preparedness, at a press conference in the last couple of days, asserted that what happened at Coutts, the arrests at Coutts, were directly related to the leadership here in Ottawa. And under questioning by the media, back down further again, and basically said, well, I'm just sort of figuring that out myself. That is not real evidence, that is not a real connection, and that is not a national security threat.
Déclaration des députés, statements by members. The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to rise in the House today to recognize a Better Tent City, an innovative and successful housing solution serving previously unsheltered neighbours of mine in Waterloo Region. Consisting of 42 insulated cabins and an indoor warming space, kitchen, showers, and laundry, a Better Tent City is a safe and caring place born from the leadership of the late Ron Doyle, Jeff Wilmer, and Nadine Green, among others. Nadine, the site coordinator and whose compassion brings calm in times of crisis, feels particularly fitting to celebrate during Black History Month, as her leadership is one example of Black excellence in Waterloo Region. A Better Tent City is supported by so many, including the volunteers, staff, and board at St. Mary's Church and the Social Development Center. In light of this incredible grassroots work, A Better Tent City recently received our community's highest honor, the Barn Raiser Award, for showing us what's possible when a group of people rally.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth Cole Harbour.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, throughout this pandemic, the people of Dartmouth Cole Harbour have shown the very best that Canada has to offer. From embracing public health measures like staying the blazes home to mourning incredible tragedies together, we've been there for each other while keeping 6 feet apart. And like all Canadians, this pandemic has worn us down. We are so tired. But just as public health measures are easing, those who seek to harm our country and our democracy through conspiracy theories and misinformation are using this opportunity to sow discord. I always see the best in people, but the rise in hate is so high. Folks in our community, our neighbors, our friends are finding themselves caught up in this. And I know that this hate and this hostility is not at the heart of who we are. Madam Speaker, I ask that all Canadians be there for each other by speaking out against misinformation and standing up against hate. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Member for Niagara West.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I think I speak for most Canadians when I say that the last 2 years have been extremely difficult. At times like this, one would think that the leader of our country, the Prime Minister, would be there to unite Canadians. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. He's done the opposite. Don't take my word for it. His own Liberal MPs have said so. The Prime Minister chose to divide Canadians as a political strategy to win an election. He pitted one Canadian against the other for his own political gain. He called Canadians tired of mandates and restrictions a fringe minority with unacceptable views. He said they're extremists, misogynist, racist, and asked if these Canadians should be tolerated. This Prime Minister has fanned the flames of division to a point of a national crisis, and his solution is to divide Canadians further, to implement unprecedented and extreme government measures through the Emergencies Act. This is a crisis that he himself created. Madam Speaker, where does this Prime Minister's recklessness stop?
The Honourable Member for Aurora Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak about Black History Month, and I know I'm not the only one to do that this month, but it should be spoken about often, which is why this year's theme is February and Forever, celebrating Black history today and every day. We need to remember Black history is Canadian history, which at times has been for the worse, but over the years has become significantly for the better. Our communities are enriched by our Black neighbours and friends who take on many important roles. The Honourable Jean Augustine, who proposed the motion we recognize February as Black History Month, was the first Black woman elected to this House. Her election showed that this House could truly be a house for all Canadians. I want to take this time to recognize and thank a community leader in Aurora. Fiona Durant, came to Canada as a young woman and established a small, successful local business. She also founded the Aurora Black Community Association. This is a dynamic, change-making group focused on uniting all the varied
L'honorable député de Longueuil-Saint-Hubert.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Février est le mois de l'histoire des Noirs. Au Conseil municipal de Longueuil, les barrières du passé ont été rompues, laissant une plus grande place à la jeunesse, aux femmes et à la diversité. Par conséquent, je salue avec fierté la nomination de 3 femmes extraordinaires au Conseil municipal de Longueuil. Madame Reine Bombo Alara, première élue de la diversité à présider le Conseil municipal. Madame Afine Loala-Lika, première femme noire au sein du Conseil exécutif. Finalement, Madame Rolande Balma, 21 ans, plus jeune femme élue de toute l'histoire de Longueuil. L'arrivée dans des postes de décision de ces 3 femmes noires au sein du Conseil de Longueuil constitue une extraordinaire avancée et le reflet de ce qu'est le Québec d'aujourd'hui. Les jeunes gens issus de la diversité sentent, avec cette élection, que la participation politique...
L'honorable député d'Alfred Pénard.
Madame la Présidente, en cette semaine de la persévérance scolaire, prenons le temps de reconnaître et d'encourager les efforts de nos jeunes qui, malgré les difficultés des 2 dernières années, gardent leur soif d'apprendre. Cette persévérance est également mise de l'avant par les enseignants, le personnel de soutien, les intervenants et les travailleurs sociaux qui accomplissent un travail colossal pour aider nos jeunes à réussir. Le travail des organismes communautaires également fait une énorme différence dans la vie des jeunes qui ont des parcours plus difficiles. Ils aident ces élèves à trouver un sens à leur cheminement scolaire et à les motiver à persévérer dans leurs études. Finalement, mais non le moindre, soulignons le rôle important des parents qui accompagnent leurs enfants tous les jours pour les épauler et les stimuler. Merci à toutes les personnes qui dévouent pour aider nos jeunes à être motivés, aux petits comme aux grands. Bonne semaine de la persévérance scolaire.
Honourable Member for Niagara Falls.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, February is Black History Month, and I wanted to take this opportunity to recognize the work being undertaken by the Niagara Military Museum, which is located in my riding. In partnership with the Canadian War Museum, the volunteers of the Niagara Military Museum worked to develop an incredible Black military history collection, which was publicly unveiled in Niagara last February. The Canadian War Museum is now showcasing these educational panels here in Ottawa so more Canadians can learn about the important contributions Black Canadians made to the defense of Canada and our freedoms. Entitled A Community at War, the Military Service of Black Canadians of the Niagara Region, the exhibition highlights the experiences of 22 Black men and women from the Niagara Region and from southwestern Ontario who served their country in uniform from the American Revolution to present day. Their experiences offer insight into the broader experiences of Black Canadians and this country's military history, and I invite all Canadians to visit the War Museum to see this marvelous exhibit. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I recently had the pleasure of meeting with family doctors from the Fraser Northwest Division of Family Practice Society, who won the $100,000 grand prize for Canada's Vaccine Community Innovation Challenge. Their Physician on a Mission campaign amplified the voices of family doctors in Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam, and beyond as trusted community members to encourage vaccinations using physicians' personal stories and expertise. Videos were produced in English, Cantonese, Korean, Farsi, and Arabic, with family doctors addressing common questions about COVID-19 vaccines, from helping new mothers to reminding us to get our second shot. This initiative has empowered Canadians to make informed decisions about their health and to protect each other. Congratulations to Dr. Yun and the Fraser Northwest Division of Family Practice Society, and thank you for your innovative and impactful work in keeping our communities healthy.
L'honorable député de Vaudreuil-Soulanges.
Mr. Speaker, 1 year ago, the Gurdwara Guru Nanak Darbar opened its doors for the first time in the historic and beautiful town of Hudson. And since doing so, it has served as a sacred place of worship for those of the Sikh faith in my community of Vaudreuil-Soulanges. But it's also served as so much more. In keeping with the guiding principles of kindness, generosity, and community, it has also served as a place for those in need of all faiths to enjoy a free, warm, and healthy meal prepared by dedicated volunteers. It is also a rallying point for business owners and families to come together to help one another by donating truckloads of foods and supplies to neighboring churches and community groups during this incredibly difficult time. For this and so much more, I rise in this House on behalf of my entire community to congratulate Harjit Singh Bajwa, Sarvdeep Singh Bhatt, Lukpatrai Singh Dinza, Gurinder Singh Johal, and the entire team at the Gurdwara Guru Nanak Darbar Hudson for their hard work and generosity over the last year. May the years and decades ahead continue to bring peace, joy, and fulfillment. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cypress Hills, Grassland.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in the House, and what else but to address this government's egregious overstep in invoking of the Emergencies Act. I now have had hundreds of constituents contact me, sincerely alarmed with the implications of this Prime Minister's draconian overstep. Because this is the same Prime Minister who stated that he admired China's dictatorship. But even Chinese state media stated that, while Hong Kong invoked the national security law against violent petrol bomb throwing mobs, they're shocked to see how the Canadian Prime Minister has cracked down on peaceful, pro-freedom protesters. Mr. Speaker, the world is watching this critical moment in our nation's capital, and they are rightly alarmed to see the leader of a G7 country, a country that has long been a beacon of freedom, come down on peaceful protesters with a sledgehammer. It is absolutely shameful, and I'm calling on the Prime Minister to lay aside his pride, listen to the very real concerns of the Canadian people, follow the science, and drop the mandates. That is the clearest path forward to resolving these tensions and healing our divided and wounded nation.
L'honorable député de
Schlager. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Les défis de la pandémie que nous vivons depuis 2020 n'épargnent personne et encore moins les jeunes. Pour de nombreux jeunes Québécois et Canadiens, poursuivre ces études est un énorme défi et la situation actuelle ne les aide pas. Que ce soit lié à leurs difficultés d'apprentissage, leur situation familiale, leur santé physique et mentale, la réussite de nos enfants doit être au cœur de nos responsabilités en tant que gouvernement et société. Nous nous devons de penser à leur réussite, de rester engagés et mobilisés pour eux, surtout en cette semaine, mais tout au long de l'année. Merci aux parents, enseignants, éducateurs, intervenants, personnels de soutien qui, à chaque jour, donnent du sens au parcours scolaire des jeunes. Dans le cadre des journées de la persévérance scolaire, mon équipe et moi avons donné de l'amour aux professeurs et au personnel scolaire de mon comté en leur offrant des paniers de biscuits soigneusement préparés par la cuisine collective de Schlager. Je les remercie et je remercie l'ensemble du travail extraordinaire que tous les enseignants font à tous les jours. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Honourable Member for Kenora.
Mr. Speaker, the illegal blockades must come to an end, and law enforcement has the resources it needs to do that without the government invoking the Emergencies Act. The Prime Minister himself has said that this act should not be the first, second, or third response, but he has been unable to tell us what his first, second, and third responses were. Mr. Speaker, after taking no action, the Prime Minister is now moving to the most extreme action. And we have seen crisis in this country before, many times in many different situations where the Emergencies Act in its current form was not utilized. Mr. Speaker, this is an unprecedented overreach, and it is a result of a failure in leadership on the part of the Prime Minister. Parliament must reverse this decision immediately.
Monsieur le Président, c'est avec joie que je m'adresse à la Chambre aujourd'hui. Avec 58 différentes municipalités dans mon comté, c'est l'occasion de célébrer ne sont pas rares. Qui plus est, bon nombre d'entre elles ont atteint une âge très vénérable. À travers le temps, des générations de citoyens et citoyennes se sont serrés les coudes pour faire de leur communauté un endroit à leur image. Alors, avec le contexte sanitaire actuel, plusieurs comités ont de redoubler d'efforts pour trouver des façons façon alternative de célébrer. Je tiens à leur rendre hommage de la façon la plus solennelle possible. Tout d'abord, Montmagny, la seigneurie de la Rivière-du-Sud, fête 375 ans. Berthier-sur-Mer, Rivière-Roy et Cap-Saint-Ignace fête 350 ans. Sainte-Hélène de Kamouraska, Saint-Anne de la Pocatière fête 175 ans. Et Saint-Pamphile, 150 ans. Et Saint-Joseph de Kamouraska, 100 ans. Je prendrai donc un moment dans les prochaines semaines pour aller les visiter, leur remettre un paquet de souvenirs et souhaiter joyeuses fêtes à tout l'ensemble de ces citoyens et citoyennes de ces municipalités, Monsieur le Président.
L'honorable député de Hull-Elmer.
Monsieur le Président, plus tôt aujourd'hui, l'équipe féminine de hockey du Canada a gagné la médaille d'or. Toutefois, j'aimerais vous parler de la relève, ici dans l'Outaouais. L'équipe M13 AAA, les Intrépides, est composée de 17 de nos meilleurs joueurs et joueuses de ma belle région. L'équipe s'est qualifiée pour le tournoi international Pee-Wee de Québec. Pour obtenir une invitation à ce tournoi prestigieux, l'Intrépide de l'Outaouais devait se classer parmi les 14 meilleures équipes de la Ligue de hockey élite du Québec. L'Intrépide M13 a relevé le défi. Et tous les joueuses et joueurs sont très fiers de représenter l'Outaouais lors de ce tournoi qui aura lieu au mois de mai. L'excellence de l'équipe canadienne, l'équipe olympique canadienne, est un phare pour tous les Canadiens. Mais rien n'arrive par accident. Leur victoire représente des années de travail acharné. Les Intrépides de l'Outaouais sont déjà sur le bon chemin. Bravo et bon succès. Go Intrépides, go!
Go Intrépides, go!
The honourable member for Hamilton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, for 3 weeks, the city of Ottawa and border crossings across the country have been under siege by blockades and occupations. People in Ottawa have been criminally harassed, assaulted, and are afraid to leave their homes. The declaration of a public order emergency is a result of the failure of all levels of government failing to keep the public safe. Canadians are rightly concerned about these unprecedented measures being enacted and about the precedent it will set. I am too. It will be critical over the course of the debate over these next few days for the government to clearly explain why they believe the conditions to enact this emergency order have been met. There is no time for talking points, spin, or partisan attacks. Canadians deserve honest answers, accurate information, and clear reasoning. Conversely, the opposition has an important role to hold the government to account, to ask serious questions, and refrain from overheated rhetoric. Mr. Speaker, today marks an important moment in our history, and there will be much work to do in these weeks, months, and years to come. We must work to rebuild trust in our institutions, and that work must begin now.
L'honorable député de Manicouagan.
The honourable member for Manicouagan.
Monsieur le Président, il me fait grand plaisir de souligner aujourd'hui la candidature officielle de l'île d'Anticosti au patrimoine mondial de l'UNESCO. Cette île est un joyau de la Côte-Nord du Québec et du monde par sa magnificence, bien sûr, son unicité et ses richesses naturelles, mais aussi par sa population chaleureuse. Cette annonce historique célébrée par la population d'Anticosti est le résultat de beaucoup de travail et l'avancement d'un projet rassembleur. Monsieur le Président, dès les balbutiements du projet jusqu'à cette annonce, j'ai travaillé avec les élus, les organismes et la population. J'ai appuyé ce projet chaque fois que les Anticostiens ont eu besoin de moi et je vais continuer de le faire jusqu'à ce qu'Anticosti soit célébré comme elle le mérite dans le monde entier. Ensemble, nous avançons et nous réussirons. Félicitations à toute la population d'Anticosti. Vous êtes la preuve que les ambitions et le travail acharné sont porteurs de grandes réalisations. Vous êtes la preuve qu'en alliant nos forces, nous sommes capables de faire partie du patrimoine mondial de l'UNESCO. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
The honourable member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Mr. Speaker, we are debating an Emergencies Act because of a political crisis of the Prime Minister's own making. A political crisis here in Ottawa because of his failure to act sooner. But there is another crisis building across our country that he and his government have failed to act on. Canadians are seeing the rising cost of living impacting them in their homes, in their backyards, in my riding of North Okanagan Shuswap, and across the country. Groceries will cost families $1,000 more this year. Energy prices have reached record levels, and rent rates are skyrocketing. Constituents have contacted me concerned about house prices going up 35 to 45%, concerned that young families can't afford their own homes. Seniors on fixed incomes cannot keep up with the inflation now pegged at 5.1%, the highest rate in 30 years. The Prime Minister and his government have failed to act on the cost of living crisis and have now created another crisis as a diversion. This is shameful. Canadians deserve better.
The honourable member for Ottawa Centre.
Thank you, Speaker. I rise in the House to honour my late friend Richard Patten, who dutifully served our community of Ottawa Centre as the Member of Provincial Parliament from 1987 to 1990 and from 1995 to 2007. During this time, he also served as Minister of Government Services and Minister of Correctional Services in Ontario. Speaker, after he retired from politics and as I succeeded him as the MPP, Richard gave me a note which read, "Remember, all of this belongs to the people." This sentiment captures the essence of Richard's brand of public service. He was your neighbor who was also your elected representative. Whether it was helping to save Ottawa's Aberdeen Pavilion, successfully fighting to keep Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario's heart surgery unit in Ottawa, or championing legislation to help people with severe mental illness, Richard Patten's legacy in Ottawa Centre will be felt forever. Speaker, as Richard bravely fought cancer, he never missed a day at the legislature or stepped away from many of his community-building activities. He died on December 30th of last year. Thank you to his wife, Penny, for sharing Richard with our community. Richard, Ottawa Centre will forever be a better place because of you. Thank you.
Oral questions, question orale, l'honorable député de Mégantic-Clérable.
Monsieur le Président, comme Canadien, aujourd'hui, je suis déçu. Ce matin, le Premier ministre a finalement daigné parler à la Chambre des communes, ce lieu sacré de la démocratie canadienne, à la suite de sa décision d'invoquer la loi sur les mesures d'urgence sur tout le territoire canadien. Il avait une occasion unique pour justifier sa décision de recourir à cette loi extrême pour mettre fin à la crise qu'il a lui-même créée. Il a échoué. Il n'a pas réussi à démontrer que les lois en vigueur ne suffisaient pas à mettre un terme aux gestes illégaux. Ma question est claire. Pourquoi ce gouvernement se sert-il d'une loi aussi radicale avec comme seul objectif de protéger le leadership du Premier ministre?
L'honorable vice-première ministre.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker,
ces sièges et ces barrages
this
causent des dommages
siege and the
importants à
blockades
notre
are
économie.
causing
La
significant damage to
confiance
our economy.
internationale envers le Canada comme endroit
The
propice au
international
investissement
community
et
needs
pour
to
faire
see
des
Canada
affaires
as a safe
est grande.
place to invest and do
L'obstruction du
business.
pont
The
ambassadeur
obstruction
a
of the
retardé
Ambassador
des
Bridge
échanges commerciaux d'une valeur de
interrupted
390
worth
millions de dollars par jour.
$390
Ces
million
coûts sont
a day.
réels.
Those
Ils
costs
menacent les
are real.
entreprises
They
grandes et
threaten
petites, et pour cette
both
raison,
big
nous
and
devons
small
réagir.
businesses, and that is
Honorable
why we
député de
must take action.
Mégantic-Clérable.
The honourable member for
Monsieur le Président,
Mégantic-Clérable.
je pense
Mr.
que
Speaker,
la ministre des
I
Finances
think
devrait
the
mettre à jour
finance minister
ses
should
points
update
de discussion.
her
Il n'y a
talking
plus de
points.
blocage à
There
Windsor,
is
Monsieur
no
le
longer any
Président.
blockade
C'est
in
fini.
Windsor.
On n'a pas eu
That's
besoin de
over.
la loi sur les
We
mesures
don't need
d'urgence,
the
Monsieur le
Emergencies
Président.
Act
Le Premier
there.
ministre a dit à plusieurs reprises que des groupes étrangers supportent
It
les
has been
manifestations ici à
repeatedly said in
Ottawa.
the media
Au
that
comité de la
foreign
sécurité
groups
publique
are
la semaine dernière, le
supporting
directeur
the
adjoint de l'information du
demonstrators in
Centre d'analyse des opérations et
And,
déclarations financières du Canada, tout un titre, ça,
an
a
intelligence
déclaré qu'il n'y avait
expert
aucune preuve pour
stated that there
supporter
was
cette
no
affirmation,
evidence to support
ni même le
that
début d'une piste de
allegation.
transaction suspecte,
Not
Monsieur le
even
Président.
any suspicious
Pourquoi,
transaction.
pour justifier sa décision, le
Why?
Premier ministre invoque-t-il
To
des
justify,
faits
is
qui
the Prime
n'existent pas
Minister
selon ses propres
basing his
experts?
decision on facts that don't even
L'honorable
exist according to his
vice-première
own
ministre.
experts? The Honourable
Monsieur
Deputy
le
Prime Minister.
Président,
Mr.
les
Speaker,
chefs d'entreprise du Canada
business leaders
savent
in Canada
que
know
ces barrages illégaux
that these illegal
ne peuvent pas
blockades
se poursuivre et
cannot
ils
go
ont
on.
appuyé
And they
l'action
supported
nécessaire
the
de
necessary
notre
action our
gouvernement.
government
Goldie Hyder,
has taken.
président
Goldie
du
Hyder,
Conseil canadien des
President
affaires,
of
a
the
dit
Canada
cette
Business Council
semaine,
said
nous
this week,
saluons cette
we
décision comme une
salute
étape
this
vers
decision
la fin des
as
blocages
a step
illégaux
towards
dans tout le
bringing the
pays
illegal
et
blockades
le
to an end all
respect de
across the
l'état
country
du droit.
and respect
C'est
for the rule of
exactement
law.
ce que nous faisons.
That's
monsieur.
Député de Mégantic-Clérable.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr.
je lui
Speaker,
répète, il n'y a
I
plus
would
de
repeat
blocage
to her,
aux frontières. Ça
there
s'est
are no
réglé
longer
sans
any
la loi
blockades
des
at the
mesures
borders.
d'urgence,
Those
Monsieur le
have been
Président. C'est
resolved
ça la
without the
réalité.
Emergencies Act.
Le
That's
recours
the
à la loi sur les
reality.
mesures d'urgence, c'est une première dans l'histoire canadienne. La précédente loi, la loi sur les mesures de guerre, n'avait été utilisée que 3 fois. Première guerre mondiale, Deuxième guerre mondiale, pendant la crise d'octobre. Vendredi dernier, le premier ministre disait qu'il n'y avait pas besoin d'autres mesures. Et tout d'un coup, lundi, on invoque la loi sur les mesures d'urgence. Bang! Est-ce que quelqu'un dans ce gouvernement peut nous dire ce qui s'est passé entre vendredi puis lundi pour que le premier ministre valse autant en seulement quelques heures?
Monsieur le Président, comme nous avons fait pendant les négociations d'ALENA, notre gouvernement fera toujours ce qui est nécessaire pour protéger nos travailleurs et l'intérêt national. Nous avons défendu le Canada pendant les négociations d'ALENA et maintenant nous défendons les Canadiens contre ces blocages et occupations.
Illegal blockades and occupation. That's what we must do, and that is what we will keep doing.
Member for South Surrey, White Rock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister and the Emergency Committee last week, Deputy Director of Intelligence for FINTRAC, Barry McKillop, stated that there is no evidence to back up these claims. In fact, he stated, quote, there has not been a spike in suspicious transactions related to the protest, end quote. Why is the Prime Minister offside with Canada's national security experts?
Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I spoke yesterday with the head of FINTRAC, and we are in close touch with that very important organization. The reality, her deputy, the reality, Mr. Speaker, is that FINTRAC lacked the necessary authorities to oversee the new world of cryptocurrency and crowdsourcing and payment platforms. With these, we have enhanced the authorities of FINTRAC, allowing us to stop the illegal funding of these illegal.
Member for South Surrey, White Rock.
Mr. Speaker, Premier contradicted 2 of his ministers who had stated that the Emergency Measures Act would be geographically located to all of Canada. All the border crossings in Manitoba and Ontario have been cleared. The state, as government overreach is interfering. Will the Prime Minister revoke this rebuilding the trust of Canadians?
Prime Minister.
Once upon a time, the Conservative Party that believed in public interest. I know one Conservative, Karen Beattie, who created. Beattie said this would inevitably be today, and I told him about the work our government is doing to defend the Canadian economy.
Honorable député de la Prairie.
Monsieur le Président, arrêtez les participants à une manifestation illégale. Tu n'as pas besoin de la loi sur les mesures d'urgence pour ça. Couper le sociofinancement d'activités illégales. Tu n'as pas besoin de la loi sur les mesures d'urgence pour ça. Donner des amendes non plus. Protéger les infrastructures stratégiques non plus. Monsieur le Président, depuis 21 jours, les moyens de s'attaquer à la crise existent. Mais depuis 21 jours, ils ne sont simplement pas utilisés par ce gouvernement. Est-ce que le gouvernement réalise que tout ce qui manquait depuis 21 jours, c'est pas la loi sur les mesures d'urgence, c'est son leadership.
Monsieur le Président, les chefs d'entreprise du Québec savent que ces blocages illégaux ne peuvent pas se poursuivre et ils ont appuyé l'action de notre gouvernement vers PDG de manufacturiers et exportateurs du Québec a dit cette semaine les manufacturiers saluent qui permettrait de rétablir l'ordre aux frontières du Canada comme partenaire
It's no joke. It's gotten to the point that the SQ are here in Ottawa to... No one needed the Emergencies Act to resolve the blockades in BC. It wasn't needed to clear the Ambassador Bridge. But the core of this crisis is parked out front. And why? Because the federal government has been in hiding for 3 weeks. The situation would be less dangerous today if they had taken first place, the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. We did take responsibility. And I really to be responsible on behalf of the Canadian responsibility for democracy, to protect the national.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The story of this pandemic has been a story of solidarity, of Canadians taking care of one another. But Canadians are now wondering what the plan is to get out of this pandemic. We know that the plan to get out of this pandemic has to include a science-based approach, and it has to include an approach to invest in our healthcare system. So will the Prime Minister commit to making sure our healthcare system is never again in the fear of collapsing, and that we have an evidence-based plan for us to move past this pandemic?
Here, here. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our country passed this pandemic thanks to the hard work, common sense of Canadians, thanks to the fact that 90% of Canadians are vaccinated, thanks to the heroism of our health. For that reason, Mr. Speaker, Canada is the Western world when it comes to mortality rates. Mortality, Mr. Speaker, an additional to pass the pandemic thanks to Canadians.
Honorable député de Burnaby Sud.
L'histoire de cette pandémie, c'est une histoire de solidarité. Les gens à travers le pays qui ont pris soin les uns des autres. Mais les gens sont frustrés. Ils ont des problèmes dans leur vie sont empirés pendant la pandémie. C'est du logement abordable. C'est de plus en plus difficile. Le Prime ministre s'engagera-t-il à travailler dans les vies des gens?
Absolutely, Mr.
Avec les municipalités, avec les provinces, avec tous les Canadiens, pour avoir une relance forte de la récession créée par la COVID. Et la bonne nouvelle, c'est que le PIB du Canada est maintenant à la même niveau qu'elle était avant le COVID. La bonne nouvelle est qu'on a récupéré tous les emplois perdus. On a du travail à faire et on va le faire ensemble.
And we will do that together.
Le député de Bellechasse-les-Échemins-Lévis.
Monsieur le Président, le Premier ministre est incapable de justifier l'utilisation de la loi sur les mesures d'urgence. Il est incapable de dire quel outil il a utilisé, quelle démarche il a mise en place avant de déposer cette loi d'exception. Il ne peut pas nous reprocher d'y voir une manœuvre pour cacher son inaction, son manque de leadership, son incurie. Je lui donne à nouveau aujourd'hui l'occasion de nous éclairer. Quels outils, quelles démarches a-t-il mis en place au cours des 3 dernières semaines qui ont à ce point échoué qu'ils justifient l'application de la loi sur les mesures d'urgence, Monsieur le Président?
L'honorable ministre de la Sécurité publique.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie ma collègue pour la question. Le gouvernement apprend beaucoup des actions concrètes de début des blocages. On avait offert plus de ressources pour les forces. Le résultat, un peu de progrès, mais mesures d'urgence et on va continuer d'offrir tous les outils que les services policiers ont besoin. Merci.
de Bellechasse, les
Monsieur le Président, le Québec et d'autres provinces ont la situation sans utiliser la loi sur les mesures d'urgence. D'ailleurs, elles n'en veulent pas. C'est prévenu d'ailleurs. Alors, ce premier ministre qui n'écoute que lui-même, la loi d'exception sans avoir consulté qui que ce soit, va-t-il respecter cette loi appliquée sur leur territoire, comme au Québec?
The Honourable Minister.